Right, so good morning and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you here with us today at the European Court of Auditors, whether you are here in person or virtually connected via Teams. We're thrilled that so many of you could make it today. Now, I have a great honor to introduce you to the conference on transparency that is organized here today by the European Court of Auditors. My name is Damien Fisher. I'm ECA Deputy Spokesperson, and I will help moderate today's session. I will also be your time and microphone policeman. And on this note, I would just like to kindly appeal to everyone in the room not to press the red button for the microphone unless you want to take the floor. And everybody on Teams, please turn off your camera for these initial sessions, turn off your microphone, but do make sure that your speakers are turned on. Apparently there was a bug in the system in the recent update, so please make sure that that's working. Now today we will build upon our recent audit reports, one on the transparency of EU funding to NGOs and the other on the transparency register for lobbyists wishing to influence EU policy making. Now, these reports have highlighted challenges and opportunities related to enhancing transparency and accountability in EU policy making and funding processes, and you will all have a chance to hear much more about these particular reports in today's panel debates from the ECA members who were in charge of them, Mrs. Laima Andrikene and Mr. York Christian Petrovic. Both of you here on the panel already. Great to have you here, both from the start already. They are also the patrons and organizers of this conference. Now, the million-euro question, of course, why is the ECA organizing this conference? Well, I can think of two. Firstly, the ECA is always championing transparency for the EU budget. And secondly, the publication of our reports is not the end of the process. We always seek to discuss them with stakeholders, either at the political level, at EU national, or academia, think tanks, NGOs, interest associations. So I think that today's conference is ticking all of these boxes. Now, I have a great pleasure on this note to invite the president of our institution to take the floor, to open the conference, set the scene, and the tone from the top, as it were. So, Mr. Tony Murphy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Damien. Colleagues and distinguished guests, experts and participants, Nicholas, very welcome to the Court of Auditors. We're always welcome. Happy to have you here. And it is indeed a real pleasure for me to open today's conference on transparency, I think, which Damien mentioned is something that we champion an awful lot. I think it's very important, and we use this word an awful lot in various contexts. So I think in the complex landscape of the EU, I think transparency is a fundamental pillar. I think it's crucial for ensuring legitimate and effective governance. And in today's global context, the fragility of values such as transparency and accountability are increasingly evident. I think we see that everywhere. So these principles can no longer be assumed. I think, which means that in our world, their preservation is paramount. So if we look at transparency in a public sector setting, why is it important? And I think the short answer is trust. And I think if we look at our new strategy for the next period, basically we're trying to foster trust through auditing. That's what our core value is for the next few years. So I think transparency is vital to public trust in the EU. It underpins accountability, it supports informed debate, and also ensures public resources are used in the public interest, which I think is one of the issues which will be covered by one of the two reports which are being considered later. So I think this conference comes at a critical moment with the negotiations for the new multi-financial framework already underway, which is occupying ourselves and our colleagues in the Con Committee quite a lot. And I think from the context of these negotiations, I think transparency it must not only be embedded in the funding and policies, but throughout the policy development and indeed throughout the negotiations. I think transparency is key. I think transparency ensures that the stakeholders, the citizens and the policymakers have a clear and accurate information about how funds will be allocated and managed. It builds trust in the EU's financial decisions and enables timely oversight. So in that context, I'm very pleased to see senior representatives from EU institutions, subject matter experts, key stakeholders and civil society organisations represented here today. Your diverse perspectives are essential to making transparency meaningful and operational, and I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you. When we look at transparency from a broader perspective, at the ECA we regularly highlight structural weaknesses across EU budgetary management that create transparency and accountability gaps. For example, with delivery models like the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the so-called RRF, we have continuously raised concerns about the transparency surrounding financial beneficiaries and highlighted significant accountability gaps at EU level. What's concerning, in a way, is that the Commission's draft proposals for the next 2028-34 MFF envisage a similar model to the RRF, in particular in relation to the National Plans package. Therefore, we think there is a real risk that the transparency issues we have already identified in the Recovery and Resilience Facility could reoccur on a much larger scale if those concerns are not addressed. Our work is already underway on a number of opinions that we will provide on the proposals. And drawing on our extensive experience, we will emphasise key risks, highlight lessons learned and stress that transparency must be a central component of future budgets. Today, the focus of your discussions will be on two special reports: the transparency of EU funding for NGOs and the lobbying of EU policymakers. Interestingly, the findings in both reports reflect similar issues related to the transparency gaps and verification processes. So transparency cannot be just a paper exercise. It must serve as a genuine tool for accountability and oversight. And while it is important that today we address the ongoing transparency challenges across EU funding and policy, we should also acknowledge that progress has been made. This year marks 50 years since the Treaty of Brussels, which strengthened the EU's financial governance by placing transparency and accountability at its core and reinforcing the discharge procedure, thanks to our colleagues in the Cont Committee. The reports that will be discussed today directly contribute to that important process of accountability. So to conclude, I would like to extend my appreciation to Lima, the York, and their teams for organising this event, and to colleagues from across the court for making it possible. I hope that your discussions are constructive and meaningful, especially, as I say, at such a critical moment when negotiations for the EU's next long-term budget are underway. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much to President Tony Murphy. Now speaking about setting the tone from the top, I have a great honour of inviting the President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, to share with us her welcoming words. Now, unfortunately, she could not be with us here today, so she sent us a video that I will ask our colleagues to play now for everybody in the room and also on Teams.
Dear friends, trust is a foundational pillar of Europe's democracy. It is the mandate given by citizens that allows our institutions to operate in their name. Without trust, there is no union. And to earn that trust, we need openness. With disinformation on the rise and the fragmentation of our media landscape, it is more important than ever that people can understand and see for themselves how Europe works. If we shut people out, we let others shape Europe's narratives and risk losing the confidence of the citizens we work for. As the House of Europe's democracy, the European Parliament recognises this truth more clearly than most. When citizens went to the ballot box last June, they put their trust in us as their elected representatives to elevate their voices and act on their behalf. And in recent years, we have taken clear, concrete steps to prove that we have listened. Putting firewalls and alarm bells in place in a comprehensive reform process that makes our Parliament more resilient and more accessible than before. This includes improving the rules of integrity and independence, implementing stricter rules across the board, because ultimately, this Parliament answers to the people it represents. And beyond this House, we can be proud that our Union remains a beacon of integrity and democracy worldwide. And here, I want to thank everyone at the Court of Auditors. Your tireless efforts are essential to keeping our Union accountable. Your professionalism, your objectivity and your commitment to doing this correctly is what helps all of us to earn that trust. And it is partly thanks to you that public approval of the European project is high. However, there is still more work to do. That is why I welcome today's discussion on how we can further strengthen our accountability to citizens. So I wish you all a successful and productive conference. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you also to President of the European Parliament. Now, I believe the set is seen for all of us now to hit the ground running. Now, this morning we have ahead of us surely 2 very interesting sessions and as many as 10 speakers overall. And after each of them, we will also take questions, time permitting, from the audience and also from those online. And we will do so via a slider tool. So in case you haven't scanned the QR code on the screen earlier on, you will have a chance to do so also later. For those on the slider, we'll take a few of those most highly voted ones. Now, we will start the first session, Transparency of EU Funding Granted to NGOs. Now, this session will be chaired by Mrs. Laima Andrikiene. Mrs. Andrikiene is a member of the European Court of Auditors. She sits in our Chamber 3, where she leads audits in the area of external action, security and justice. And she was previously also a member of the European Parliament, a member of the Parliament in Lithuania, and held various ministerial positions. So really well placed to lead this debate. And on this note, dear Laima, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Damien. Good morning and welcome to the first session of our Transparency Conference here in Luxembourg. I'm honored to start session 1 and to set the tone for what I am certain will be a stimulating and constructive dialogue. But before that, I would like to briefly introduce the full panel of esteemed speakers. To the right, Nicholas Herbst, Chairman, Budgetary Control Committee of the European Parliament, Madame Gabriela Civiko, President, Civil Society Europe. We have Michael Erhardt, Director, DG Budget, European Commission, and Professor Jurgita Paužaitė-Kulvinskienė, who is the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law of Vilnius University from Lithuania. So great to have you all here, and I look forward to hearing your insights and to discuss topics which are on our agenda today. Now let me tell you more about the audit report, for which I was responsible and which the European Court of Auditors published a few months ago. Transparency. Transparency in allocation and use of EU funding, including for non-governmental organizations, sits at the very heart of our democratic values and public trust. And it is this vital theme that we gather to address today. Let me begin by underscoring why transparency matters so greatly in this context. Public transparency ensures that citizens have access to clear and accurate information about how decisions are made and resources are allocated. It enables every single one of us to hold public authorities to account, to understand who receives funding, why it is granted, and how it is ultimately spent. This principle is especially significant for NGOs, which play a pivotal role in empowering civic participation and shaping democratic policymaking through ongoing dialogue and advocacy. The credibility of this participation, however, hinges on full transparency. The issue of transparency in EU-funded NGOs has gained a lot of attention in recent years, not least following the Qatargate scandal in 2022. This episode cast a spotlight on the risks posed by opaque funding practices and prompted the European Parliament in its January 2024 resolution to call for greater accountability and openness in the distribution of EU grants, including those to NGOs. The debate has only intensified since, becoming one of the central themes in political discourse and a matter of growing public concern. What are our key findings and where we stand now? Our most recent audit paints a complex picture. While there has been some progress since our previous audits, EU funding for NGOs remains shrouded in opacity. Information about grants, recipients, and the use of funds is often unreliable and insufficiently transparent. Crucially, the European Commission has not always adequately disclosed advocacy activities, such as lobbying, financed by EU grants. Furthermore, active checks to ensure that funded NGOs uphold core EU values, like the rule of law and human rights, are lacking. These shortcomings expose the Union to reputational risks and undermine public confidence. To illustrate, between 2021 and 2023, over 7 billion euros in EU funding was awarded to NGOs in key internal policy areas, including cohesion, research, migration, and the environment. Yet, much of this information is fragmented, and many recipients remain uncategorized in information systems. More than 90% of entities paid during this period were not clearly classified as NGO or non-NGO, increasing the risk of misreporting and severely limiting the quality of data accessible to the public. This not only hampers transparency, but also restricts our ability to analyze whether funds are concentrated among a small group of organizations and to assess NGOs' true influence on EU policies. What are the challenges and risks, and in fact, what is the impact of poor transparency? The consequences of this lack of clarity are profound. Without reliable data and robust oversight, the EU runs the risk of misallocating funds, undermining policy effectiveness, and eroding public trust. The inability to accurately classify recipients and monitor their adherence to EU values limits both accountability and the credibility of our institutions. It also constrains meaningful analysis and informed debate among policymakers, journalists, and citizens alike. Still, there are positive developments and steps in the right direction and reasons for optimism. The Commission has taken steps to improve data collection since our last audit in 2018, and last year as a definition of an NGO, but I would like to stress this, in 2024, a definition of an NGO independent from government and non-profit was adopted at the EU level. While this represents progress, definitions still vary across member states, and only 6 have codified them in their national legislation. Criteria for NGO classification also differ between Commission's departments and agencies, leading to inconsistencies and confusion. Nevertheless, the move towards harmonization is encouraging and marks a genuine step forward. What are remaining gaps? What still needs our attention? Despite these advantages, significant gaps persist. Classification and oversight of NGOs remain inconsistent, with self-declaration often the only check on status. There have been cases where organizations with clear government influence or commercial interests have been misclassified as NGOs. Moreover, information on advocacy activities funded by EU grants is not proactively disclosed, and checks on compliance with EU values are insufficient. What are our recommendations? The path forward. In light of our findings, our recommendations are clear. We urge the Commission to implement consistent classification of NGOs across all departments, enhance the quality and accessibility of spending data, and actively verify compliance with EU values. Regulatory improvements must also encourage member states to report on payments, which would significantly bolster transparency and build public trust. Some changes have already been announced for the coming years, but further action is needed to ensure that these reforms have the desired impact. Finally, a centralized platform with data from all management modes and levels of government would be a transformative step forward. As we embark on today's conference, I would like to use this opportunity and to invite all attendees, policymakers, civil society leaders, and journalists to engage openly and constructively. The challenges we face are not insurmountable, but they do require commitment, collaboration, and a shared resolve to strengthen transparency and accountability in EU funding. Let us seize this opportunity to drive meaningful change and champion the principles that underpin our democracy. So before I give the floor to other panelists of this session, still, in conclusion, first of all, I would like to note that the issue at the heart of this report is not whether NGOs are transparent. It is whether the Commission ensures transparency in how EU funds are allocated to NGOs. The primary responsibility for providing clear, complete, and accessible information lies with the institutions managing the EU budget. Citizens have the right to know who is funded, how much is granted, for what purpose, and under what conditions. Our audit shows that this information is currently fragmented, incomplete, and in many cases not timely. Furthermore, while NGOs are required to respect EU values, the Commission does not verify this compliance proactively. What is also important, ensuring transparency, it is not a matter of bureaucracy. It is a matter of public trust and democratic accountability. And we are not calling for more red tape. We are calling for smarter oversight. Let us make transparency a tool for empowerment, not a burden. So we therefore urge the Commission to implement our recommendations, strengthen internal systems, and be fully transparent with the public. And this is not about questioning the role of NGOs. Not at all. It's about reinforcing the credibility of how EU funds are managed and reported. So thank you for your attention. That is what I wanted to say. Presenting our work done under the roof of this EU institution. And Damian, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Laima Andrikienė, as a member of the European Court of Auditors. This certainly sets the foundation for our talk today. You have already introduced your esteemed panelists towards your right. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome with us also Mr. Jan Gregor, who is the Dean of our Chamber 5 of Administering and Financing the Union, and he will be at the end of the session providing a conclusion for all of us connecting the dots. And now, you all know that auditors are very keen on asking questions. Dear Laima, as the chair, what would be your first question to the panelists?
Thank you. So our first speaker is Mr. Nicholas Herbst. So I would like to ask you first, Nicholas, from the European Parliament's perspective, and in light of the Parliament's resolution calling for greater transparency and accountability in EU funding, including to NGOs, what specific legislative or policy measures do you So what specific legislative or policy matters do you believe are necessary to address the persistent transparency gaps? And additionally, how can the Parliament ensure that these measures are effectively implemented by EU institutions and across EU member states? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and also, of course, dear Tony, dear Jan, distinguished panelists, dear guests. First of all, it's a very bold decision to invite a politician to talk about trust, because, as you know, we have sometimes our own approach towards trust. Nevertheless, let me start by thanking you and the whole European Court of Auditors for putting up this report, which was very important for us during the process, and also this conversation on the table. Transparency in public spending, I mean, we cannot overestimate the importance of that. Politically, I can tell you it is extremely important if you talk to voters. They want to know what we do with the money and how we earn and keep democratic trust. When we spend in line with our values, we strengthen our EU's legitimacy. When we do not, or when we cannot show that we do, we weaken it. And the Court of Auditor tells us, you told us in your report, there is a clarity that despite progress, the transparency of EU funding is, and you repeated that very impressively, is not sufficient, and that is the headline that we must respond to. Public scrutiny, and you also mentioned that, has, intensified since Qatargate, where we do have to bear in mind that the court case has not yet been opened, and there are still a lot of questions, and I have my special view on it. Nevertheless, Parliament's own resolution in January 2024 called for greater transparency and accountability of EU fundings to all recipients, and that of course includes NGOs. This report takes stock against the political backdrop. So from Parliament's side, and that is probably the answer to your question, to address the transparency gaps, we need to have a common recipient identifier, so FTS, financial transparency systems, and other databases can be joined and updated more frequently, oblige managing authorities to publish machine-readable payments tagged for NGOs in shared management, introduce proportionate sub-grant disclosure above simple thresholds in direct management, and mandate a clear EU-funded advocacy label for operating grant activities with an automatic cross-link to the transparency register. So if guidance does not deliver consistent practice, the financial regulation and relevant program rules may need to be updated to I would say, codify these operational issues while keeping the burden low through simple templates and thresholds. I think that's the way to go forward. To ensure delivery by the institutions and across member state, my committee, the Budgetary Control Committee, tracks time-bound discharge milestones. We are going to use the scrutiny working group, about which we will probably discuss later, for targeted hearings, apply budgetary remarks for focused reserves if milestones should slip, and where guidance and IT upgrades are insufficient. Table targeted legislative amendments, that's our job, of course, so these transparency requirements, including shared management data, become binding, uniformly binding. We are discussing a significant monetary envelope here, as you mentioned, 7.4 billion in commitments to NGOs, 4.8 billion under direct management, and about 2.6 billion via shared management. This is not just a small percentage of the budget, it's more. It's meaningful money and highly sensitive in terms of public trust, highly sensitive. So if I may structure my remarks around 5 key issues, the first would be, who are we really funding? And this is a classification problem. You already were very clear about it. The Court of Auditors, you confirmed to us that the financial transparency system largely relies on self-declaration to label recipients as NGOs. The Commission checks whether an entity is private and, of course, non-profit. but not whether it is genuinely independent from government or whether it does not pursue its members' commercial interests, both of which are essential for me to character an NGO. So, in the court's sample, correct me if I'm wrong, over a quarter of entities were incorrectly marked as NGOs, including state-dependent bodies and organizations clearly serving industry interests. So, even worse, in the 2021 to 2023 accounting data, the NGO, non-NGO field was left blank for more than 90% of entities. That is over 70,000 records, undermining the reliability of this public listing in general. So yes, since September 2024, we have a legal EU definition of an NGO.
Excuse me, Mr. Herbst. Just a small intervention. It seems that there might be a bug and that the conference room is muted. We're getting some feedback from those connected online, and there's over 100 of those. So I would just like to, I'm very sorry to interrupt you to make this important announcement to our redaction back in the room.
Well, that's okay. That gives me the opportunity to have a short sip here. Tony, all the best. Thank you. So, I was referring to the new legal EU definition of an NGO in the financial regulation, and if I may quote, it says, a voluntary, independent from government, non-profit organization which is not a political party or a trade union. So, that's a good step forward, but the operational yardsticks still vary across programs and member states, and the definition alone does not stop misclassification. So the first of your recommendations therefore asks the Commission to clarify by 2025 how to interpret independent from government. So what does it mean? And how to treat entities that exist to promote members' commercial interests, and we fully support that call for a clarification. So the Commission partially accepts the recommendations and cites the simplification agenda as a reason to avoid also bureaucracy and extra paperwork. Our view is simple. Simplification cannot mean opacity. Public money must meet a know your counterparty standard. That is extremely important. So the second question is, do recipients respect EU values? And this is a verification gap. Respect for EU values, including, of course, democracy, the rule of law, human rights, is a contractual obligation in our grants and not just for the specific EU-funded action. Yet the Court finds reliance on self-declaration and not a proactive search for breaches or the use of available informations, including all sources. In particular, funding sources are usually not checked, even though they can reveal who stands really behind an NGO and whether there are conflicts of interest for, or what we're looking for, foreign influence, or at least a risk for foreign influence. In the sample, public authorities were the main funders of most NGOs, and for half of them the EU budget was the largest single source. So, facts that raise the bar for our own due diligence. The European Court of Order recommends to develop risk-based verifications for compliance with EU values by 2028. And the Commission accepts this and points out to tools like EDS and Erachna, of course, noting they were designed for fraud and conflict of interest rather than for value screening. It proposes to consider additional reliable indicators. Our budgetary control committee's measures is that it's good, but now let's speed up a bit. Let's accelerate. We do not need a blanket new bureaucracy, but we do need smart, proportionate checks that actually detect problems early, starting with risk signals around governance, funding dependencies, or patterns that breach Article 2 values. Third point, can citizens see where the money goes? So there's a data gap and fragmentation. The Commission has improved its grant management and calls for proposals are by and large, I would say, transparently published, but the public overview remains unreliable. The Financial Transparency System database is updated annually with information that may be 1.5 years out of date, and amendments are not consistently reflected. The court even found a case where the grant agreement committed 549 million, but the FDS showed 317 million at the time of check. That's the time of check. And the FDS focuses on first-level recipients, second-level recipients. For instance, when a grantee re-grants are a black box under direct management. So, under indirect management, another problem emerges. The FDS shows commission payments to implementing partners, sometimes marked to NGOs. Yet the Commission's own system indicates that in the audited cases, only around 10% of these amounts reached NGOs as final recipients. And there's no machine-readable, consolidated public listing of financial recipients across 50 plus implementing bodies. So under shared management, member states are not required to monitor or report the share going to NGOs, and 2 large member states could not provide the figures when asked. So meanwhile, the absence of a common identifier for recipients makes cross-checks and concentration analysis difficult today. CONT therefore supports the court's recommendation to improve the completeness and timeliness of FTA's data, so to cover second-level recipients wherever feasible. The Commission only partially accepts this, committing to explore more frequent updates and to include second-level data for indirect management after 2027, but not for direct management, again citing burden and legal definitions. A related point is concentration. The court shows that from 2014 to 2023, 30 NGOs received more than 40% of direct management NGO funding, 40%. That is 3.3 billion euros. So that, of course, raises fair questions about access and also pluralism. So the Commission's very low value grants category may help broaden participation, but without better visibility and identifiers, we cannot measure progress. Fourth, transparency around advocacy and lobbying. The court found cases where operating grants financed advocacy, including meetings with MEPs, but this was not clearly disclosed in the public information available through the funding and tenders portal. In May 2024, the Commission issued internal guidance that grant agreements should not require recipients to lobby EU institutions. And you can imagine that this is quite an important issue for the Parliament. Recognizing the reputational risk, even where such activities may be legal, so it's not about legality, it's also a political issue, and that was a good and immediate fix. The next step is to ensure that where operating grants support advocacy as part of an NGO self-defined work program, that fact is clearly labeled and searchable and cross-linked to the transparency register, so citizens, and it's one thing that we can see, but it's also important for the citizens, that they can see what is being funded by whom, and of course, for what purpose. Last but not least, the fourth point is building trust while protecting civic space. This debate is not about limiting Europe's civic space. Civil society is extremely important to the European Parliament, you can imagine. So the treaty calls for open, transparent, and regular dialogue with civil society, we know that, and NGOs are indispensable to policy design and delivery. That's a part of our political system. But the best way to protect the space, the civic space, is to ensure it is credible and transparent so that citizens can see the public money supports pluralism, not privilege, and values, and not double standards. So the court's assessment of voluntary transparency among NGOs shows a wide variation. Larger NGOs tend to disclose more, that's what we can see, while smaller ones, they struggle more with reporting. And that calls for targeted support, model templates, micro-grant disclosure summaries, recognition of independence, transparency at accreditations, and not for lowering the bar on transparency. So, what should be the actions? Let me close with that. From the Commission, we acknowledge the progress, common applications registration, e-grants, training and guidance on EU values obligations since already mid-2023, the May 2024 clarification on lobbying, and the new legal base for a central recipients website. That's good. But on these 3 recommendations issued by the Court, Cont would like to see more and sooner. In particular, operational grants on NGOs classification by 2025, with concrete thresholds for governmental control and clear treatment of member interest organizations. Also, we could need is a roadmap for FDS frequency upgrades and subgrant visibility across management modes with pilots in high risk or high materiality programs. And finally, a phased risk-based EU values verification starting in 2026. Leveraging existing data, the transparency register, open source checks, and proportionate sampling, so we do not wait until 2028 for the first results. So from the European Parliament and the Cont Committee, our role is to hold the budget to account and to support the Commission member states in getting this right. And in the context of the discharge procedure, Cont will track the implementation of the Court recommendations against these time-bound milestones, and we will support proportionate transparency procedures that are realistic for small organizations, thresholds to avoid undue burden, and recognition of credible transparency initiatives. Let me also say a few words on the Cont scrutiny group, or we can do this later during the discussions if you like, because it will be also a very political matter. So let me end by saying that transparency is not an end in itself. It is the condition for trust, and trust is the condition for a living democracy. We can make the system simpler and more transparent if we are clear about the basics, know who we fund, know where their money also comes from, know what we are funding, and verify that EU values are respected. This is just a fair deal for the taxpayers, for civil society, and for Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Thank you. I'm looking forward to our discussion and the opportunity to raise maybe some more specific questions. But now our next speaker is Ms. Gabriela Civico, President of the Civil Society Europe. Gabriela, we would appreciate your answers, your replies from the NGOs perspective. And I have 2 questions to you at the beginning. Given the concerns about misclassification and insufficient disclosure of lobbying activities, how can NGOs themselves contribute to enhancing transparency and public trust in the use of EU funds? And the second question, what best practices could be adopted sector-wide to support smarter oversight without adding unnecessary administrative burden? The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. On behalf of Civil Society Europe, I would just like to say how pleased we are to be invited to take part in this important event. As the platform of civil society organizations at the EU level, which gathers networks of European and national membership-based organizations active in all areas of life, our mission is to work on promoting an open, transparent and regular dialogue with the EU institutions in all areas of EU action. We share the Court's belief and the belief we've also heard from the European Parliament about the importance of transparency and accountability of EU funding at all levels. As representative organizations established and composed by citizens, this is a key value that we stand by and fully support. The question that you pose seems to shift the requirements of accountability and transparency onto the recipients of the funding. But we would like to point out that we think that the European Commission and Member States are together responsible for ensuring that there is transparency in how the funding is spent. It is the responsibility of recipients to fulfill the requirements that they are set. I also want to point out that transparency is not only about how funds are spent, but also about how they are distributed through open calls, having equal access, etc., as we've already heard as well the importance of this point. We, of course, support the fact that beneficiaries must abide by contractual requirements, abide by the requirements in the grant agreements, and that all voluntary initiatives to make sources of funding and activities open and transparent should be encouraged. In fact, in Civil Society Europe, we consistently try to do this in our work, and we also try to provide guidance that favours and promotes exchange of good practice amongst our membership and amongst civil society in general. For this, we're inspired, for example, by work that's already been done at the Council of Europe level. We would rather like to disagree with claims that EU funding granted to non-governmental organisations is too opaque. We read this in the European Court of Auditors press release about the report. For something to be opaque, we think it would imply a lack of available information. But the ECA report only focused on one database, the Financial Transparency System. This already contains an important amount of information and allows searching for obtaining information on all funding received by individual beneficiary entities. The structure of the Financial Transparency System provides the same information regardless of entity type. Therefore, we would argue, if there is an opaqueness around NGO funding, then this must also be the case for other typologies of recipients, such as companies, public bodies, etc. NGO is the only subcategory searchable on the Financial Transparency System, and it is based purely on self-definition, with, at the moment, very little guidance. So we hope that this will improve in the future. We don't find it very helpful at the moment asking beneficiaries to self-define as an NGO. We also don't find it very suitable or helpful for the general public or anybody trying to investigate or look or has an interest in how EU money is spent, that why NGO is the only subcategory searchable. Why can't we search, for example, for SMEs or other kinds of subcategories within the database? Saying all this, we believe that the Commission already has higher standards on transparency of funding as compared with the Member States, for example. But nevertheless, some improvements to the situation could be made. We think that better centralisation of the information available, including the data available on the funding and tenders portal, where in addition to funding committed and paid, all the so-called deliverables of grants, so all the outputs, all the events organised, publications, everything that's a product of the grant, is all available on the funding and tenders portal. And there are summaries of the objectives and the results for each project are included there. We think that the inclusion of the funding and tenders portal, together with information provided in the Financial Transparency System, would create a fuller picture of the reality of the situation. We also support, as we've already heard, that we really need more regular updates and we need more timely information. There is a lag of several years regarding what information we can find about the grants, despite the fact that as beneficiaries, we are uploading all the information about how our grants are spent in real time. But the delay between us uploading the information and the publication and availability of that information to the public certainly can cause some concerns and can erode trust. We need to make the Financial Transparency System website more user-friendly, making it more accessible to citizens, media, civil society organisations to navigate its structure easily. We, Civil Society Europe, stand ready to support, to help, to guide how this could be done in practice. We would like to see the possibility for more detailed and targeted searches of different types of beneficiaries, different types of funding, that includes both grant and tenders. Let's not forget that NGOs are not the main beneficiary category of EU funding, so we would like for all EU funding recipients to be easily searchable, easily identifiable. Companies, consultancies, trade associations, public bodies receive proportionately higher amounts and should also be searchable as categories in the website. We welcome the fact that it will soon be possible in the Financial Transparency System to access information on both shared and indirect managed funds, that will also lead to greater transparency at member state levels on their use of the EU funds. As far as misclassification that we've heard about, we appreciate the recommendation of the European Commission to issue better and more complete guidance to beneficiaries for NGO self-declarations. We believe until now there's been a great deal of confusion around this, given that grants are given not on the basis of the status of being an NGO, not on the status of being a non-governmental organization, but they're given on the status of being a not-for-profit organization. And in fact, NGO is not really, as to our knowledge, a legal status in really the member states. The legal status is rather focused on the not-for-profit categorization rather than the NGO. And although now we do have clearer guidance at the European level, this needs to be filtered down and put into practice also in terms of registration of organizations, and that organizations can understand better, whilst being a not-for-profit, are they also an NGO or not. So we agree with the court that a more precise definition of beneficiaries, that includes NGOs, if this is indeed the preferred term to be used beyond civil society or beyond not-for-profit, defining better this term NGO, which we're already taking steps towards that, would provide policymakers with more precise information on the impact of budgetary allocations to specific types of beneficiaries. As regards the disclosure of lobbying, advocacy activities, rather, as we would call it, we would distinguish rather between lobbying activities, which generally are understood to be for commercial interests, to advocacy activities which are sharing, which are communicating the opinions, the wishes, the missions of citizens. The most adequate tool that we currently have for this is the EU Transparency Register. And we would like to highlight that this register also applies to NGOs, to not-for-profits, to the recipients of the EU funding that we're talking about today. So the EU Transparency Register is open to all of us. I would also like to point out that as NGOs, as not-for-profits, we have a key additional requirement as compared to all other entities on the Transparency Register. We have to disclose the sources of our funding. Other organizations, other entities within the Transparency Register don't have to record the sources of their funding. So in this case, we have argued, and many of you have heard us say it before, that actually NGOs are subject to a higher level of scrutiny, and there is a higher level of transparency, and therefore potentially creating a higher level of trust by the fact that we are required to disclose the sources of our funding when other entities are not. As I've mentioned, the EU Funding and Tenders portal has all the outputs of all our grants available, and we think that this also increases the level of transparency as compared with other kinds of grants, other kinds of expenditure which are given, where this requirement to disclose all outputs is not there a requirement. I would like to turn now to the discussions in the framework of the EP on the discharge to the Commission on the funding of NGOs, and also the concerns that we've heard that have been raised by the European Parliament about the grants that have been given to NGOs. We would like to stress that when grants are given to NGOs, this is not a contract for a service delivery. This is a grant agreement that's based on an open call for proposals. The open call for proposals in itself is based on a directive which makes funding available. It's based on a regulation for funding, rather. NGOs on the wishes, on the will of their membership. These are democratically organized NGOs. Prepare grant applications, based on what they want to do, what they would like to deliver. And if the European Commission sees fit, then these grants are then granted, and there is a grant agreement. These are not service contracts, and I think there's some confusion around this, especially around the area of advocacy activities. This is not the European Commission contracting NGOs to do advocacy activities. This is a grant agreement which may or may not include advocacy activities. Often they do include advocacy activities because this is actually part of the regulation, that the regulation is actually calling for dialogue with civil society on particular topics. So therefore, to be successful in getting these grants, the NGO has to prove its capacity and its interest to enter into this kind of dialogue. Yes? Okay. To enter into this kind of dialogue. We would perhaps like to stress that the guidance note that I think we are all familiar with has perhaps created some confusion around advocacy activities. And from what we have seen, even with the guidance note, that no NGOs have been in breach of what actually is allowed regarding advocacy activities, and therefore the concept of reputational risk is rather unfounded. So I will finish here, perhaps just to say that simplified access to funding without having to explain in great detail work around advocacy could also help with the situation and avoid confusion around what NGOs are actually doing when they are dialoguing with policymakers, which is actually usually a requirement of the grants. So thank you very much, and we can go on deeper later in the discussions.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Michael Erhardt from the European Commission, DG Budget. And Michael, from the European Commission's perspective, our audit highlighted the lack of a centralized and reliable overview of EU funding to NGOs, as well as inconsistencies in the classification and verification of NGOs. What concrete steps is the Commission planning to take to improve the transparency and reliability of funding information? And how will the updated financial regulation address these shortcomings? And of course, you will say much more than, replies to my questions, but now the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, and thank you above all first for the invitation to join here for this conference. And as a starting point to underline three things, thank you first for the cooperation on this report. I think we had very constructive discussions with real outcomes. Second, I want to recall that the Commission is fully committed to respect all our obligations with respect to transparency on EU funding. And third, the Commission remains fully committed to supporting civil society operations in line with all the funding instruments that we have. Now, to go concretely to your question, a first point is about difficulties identifying how much support goes to non-governmental organizations. In a way, this is no surprise because, as already mentioned, until 2024, September, 13 months ago, there was no EU-wide definition of an NGO, and therefore one was looking for something that was not to be indicated in the first place. So now we have the definition of an NGO, which has the three elements of being voluntary, of being non-governmental, and of being non-profit and not 4 and 5, a political party and a trade union. We have that here. We have heard and committed to the suggestion to see whether the element of non-governmental and non-profit can be further clarified. We are looking into this. To my knowledge, so far, we have not received much input in terms of applicants struggling to define on this point, but we will certainly look into that question. I'm really happy that there is so much talk about a financial transparency system, and I hope this is being carried forward because we would be most happy if more people take a look at this and use it. Incidentally, I had a check non-governmental organizations are not the only category. Also, non-profit can be separately searched. And if you do it, you will see there's also a lot of non-profit clearly identified, which, because they're government-controlled, do not classify as NGOs, for example, big research foundations that are out there. The second step that is now in place is that with the revised financial regulation in force since September 2024, we have an obligation to indicate the NGO status in grant applications. This is now possible. We have the definition of what is an NGO, and now we can also ask for indicating this in the application for grants. And that then takes us back to the request to improve also the financial transparency system. There are several work streams. One is ongoing as I speak, that is to try to improve the IT system for faster upgrades, so that information that is there is also more rapidly made public. For the moment, we use an annual update, but colleagues are looking into the possibility to provide this more quickly. And second, that is for the nearer future, also with the help of the European Parliament, we now have an obligation from 2028 for the member states to feed their recipient data into a future improved financial transparency system. And finally, something that has not been mentioned yet, because this is also really very new, we have in the Commission proposals for the next multi-annual financial framework, in the so-called performance regulation proposal, we propose the creation of a so-called single gateway that, if made real, would actually do what has been mentioned, bring together the information we have in the financial transparency system, which would be reinforced with the shared management data, plus the data from the funding and tender portal that has already been mentioned here. So this is, of course, a very ambitious thing to do, but the idea is there, and the Commission would very much like to go ahead with this. Let's see whether the legislator will support this proposal as well, because we do think that this would be really the big goal to bring it all together and allow also for the link. And to conclude, so that's already where we're going for the future. Yes, and as this was also mentioned on the question of values declaration. So the Financial Regulation Review 2024 brought so-called explicit exclusion grounds that every applicant has to meet, no matter whether a private company, a research institution, a non-profit, an NGO, etc., that they have to declare upfront not to be in infringement of. And the added exclusion grounds are explicitly linked to EU values, for example, incitement to hatred. But this comes on top of a long list of other exclusion grounds that we have already had for everyone applying for EU funding. For everyone, the basic approach is self-declaration, with the tens of thousands of applicants that the Commission and notably its executive agencies handle every year. This is the only way to go about. And then, based on a risk analysis, further checks can and will be done. But based on the data that is available to the Commission, there is no specifically higher risk identified, both with respect to EU values or other areas of exclusion grounds, be it fraud risk or non-payment of social security contributions, whatever we have in the list, that would, based on the data we have, require a higher scrutiny of non-governmental organizations. I stop here not to take too much time, but happy to continue in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am looking at the clock, and we still have, I hope, enough time for our discussion. But our last but not least speaker of this panel is Jurgita Paužaitė-Kulvinskienė. As I already mentioned before, she is the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law of the University of Vilnius, my alma mater. So Jurgita, from a legal perspective, the European Court of Auditors report notes that definitions of NGOs and transparency requirements vary significantly across EU member states, and that self-declarations are often relied upon without sufficient verification. From a legal perspective, what are the potential risks of this fragmented approach? And what legal or regulatory reforms would you recommend, ensuring consistent and credible oversight of EU-funded NGOs? So, Jurgita, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Mrs. Laima-Andrikien, distinguished panelists, dear participants, the audience. It is a privilege for me really to contribute to this discussion on one of the most, let's say, pressing questions in contemporary European governance, how to ensure the transparency and legality of EU-funded non-governmental organizations. When addressing the legal framework surrounding NGOs, we consider it the fundamental right to association, enshrined in both in EU Charter of Fundamental Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. And let me remember one sentence of Aristotle. He observed, "Person is by nature a political animal, a being who seeks collective association for moral and civic purposes. And as modern constitutionalism shows, this natural tendency must be framed by law to prevent its misconduct and to ensure accountability." Starting with a legal definition problem. What is the NGO in EU law? Both the European Court of Auditors special report and recent police debates begins with a critical point, the absence of a coherent legal definition of NGO at EU level. For decades, the European Union operated without a single binding definition. Instead, the concept evolved through administrative praxis rather than legal codification. The first example is the European Commission's communication from 2001, number 428, defines NGOs as voluntary, independent, non-profit making organization that pursue objectives of general interest. With this definition captured the functional spirit of NGOs, but it's lacked on legal force. And each member state, therefore, developed its own national criteria. From a legal perspective, such a fragmented approach to defining and to regulate non-governmental organizations within the European Union has generated multiple risks relating to transparency, accountability, and protection of human rights. As a response to the problem of diverse NGO definition, a universal notion of NGO was introduced last year in 2024, EU financial regulation, aiming to harmonize the approach towards NGOs across Europe. This marks, from my point, really a significant step towards establishing a common understanding of what constitutes an NGO eligible to EU funding. However, fragmentation prior to this reform had led to different treatment across member states and encouraged a form of legal forum shopping. Their entities could strategically choose the most favorable jurisdiction in which to be recognized as NGO and thereby access EU funds more easily. Although the new harmonized approach seeks to eliminate such discrepancies, unsupervised and insufficiently verified self-declarations by organizations still pose a serious threat to the integrity of the NGO definition. This can lead to unfair advantages for certain entities, and the borderline may even conflict with EU competition law and state aid rules by granting de facto financial advantages through public funds. Transparent allocation of EU funds should therefore be treated as a core legal and ethical obligation, not only to safeguard the functioning of the EU internal market, but also to protect the fundamental freedom of movement, particularly the free movement of capital. So the legal risk of fragmentation can be stated as follows. First of all, inconsistent legal recognition of NGOs across member states undermine the principle of equal treatment under Article 20 Charter of Fundamental Rights. Unequal transparency standards expose the EU to reputational and financial risk, as enforcement remains dependent on divergent national system. Legal uncertainty persists regarding the protection of freedom of association, especially when national laws impose burdensome reporting requirements on foreign-funded NGOs, and weak enforcement mechanisms in relating with principle of public administration and to act only ex post and lack on preventive oversight capacity. To having in mind such a risk, I would like to mention and to stress some specific points mentioned in the special reports. First of all, the question concerning the classification and the risk of self-declaration. The ECA recommends improving the guidelines for NGO classification. At present, as was mentioned, European Commission includes recipients and NGO based primarily on self-declaration, without prior factual verification. This approach mirrors the licensing based on self-declarations model found in administrative law, a simplified procedure whereby applicants declare compliance with legal requirements and the authority grant status without ex-ante control. While this mechanism can promote efficiency and reduce bureaucracy delay, it also increases the risk of legal uncertainty and abuse. Applicants, in some exceptional cases, may unintentionally or intentionally provide inaccurate information. Authorities, in turn, may issue decisions based on unverified data. Self-declaration system without screening and supervision erode that reliability. In the case of NGO financing, this means that funds may be allocated to entities that do not meet the criteria of independency or non-profit purposes, undermining the principles of legality and good administration, Article 41 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Moreover, such reliance on self-declaration creates ambiguity and accountability. If a false declaration is later discovered, it is responsibility borne by the declarant or by institution what failed to verify it in time. As in the report was emphasized, post factum control is essential. The report concludes that this declaratory licensing undermines the ability of EU funding and calls for a unified system of verification and accountability. The second point. The second problem identified in the special report, financial transparency and data standardization. The report noticed that Commission's financial transparency system provides incomplete, outdated, and inconsistent information. Funding data are often not updated following amendments to grant agreement and dotation, and actual funds transfers cannot always be traced. In some cases, only 10% of funds categorized as NGO-related reached actual NGOs. To address this, the ECA proposes the standardization and digitalization of financial reporting. Such approach would be, from my point, very positive, because we can see the parallel practice in the financial sector, as exemplified by European Central Bank Regulation of 2015/534, which mandates standardized formats and strict reporting deadlines. Implementing a similar structure in NGO oversight would greatly improve accountability. The question of problem number 3. The question of a unified register and balance between transparency and privacy. Linked to the data standardization is the debate over a unified EU NGO register, consolidating data from all management levels. While this could eliminate duplication and prevent double funding, it must comply with the fundamental rights protections. I would like to have in mind the decision of the Court of Justice in the joint case of VM and Sovim SA versus Luxembourg Business Register, in that case, the court held that overly broad public access to beneficial ownership information can violate Article 7 and 8 of Charter of Fundamental Rights, protecting privacy and personal data. This, while a unified NGO register could promote openness and equality, but public access should be limited to legitimate interest, for example, to auditors, supervisory authorities, or researchers acting in public interest. And finally, the case against the Commission against Hungary. There, the CG found that Hungary's law required foreign-funded NGOs to public disclose their donors, breach both the freedom of capital and freedom of association. And the last point, what I would like to take into account, compliance with EU values. The ECJ theatre recommended creating a risk-based system for monitoring compliance with EU values, applicable both before and after funding is granted for NGO. Such oversight could be contractual. Grant agreement should include explicit clauses on adherence to EU values and corresponding sanction for non-compliance. Even where such clauses are absent, a failure to respect EU values should entail legal consequences, as the rule of law demands that no right arises from illegality. Oversight without consequences undermines the idea of legality. Still, compliance mechanisms for NGO should be preventive rather than punitive. ECA data shows that smaller NGOs typically have lower self-transparency score, which can be explained by a lack of administrative capacity, and this indicates that smaller NGOs still have room to grow and to reach the transparency levels as larger organizations. It should also be noted that larger NGOs tend to attract more attention and therefore have a stronger incentive to be transparent. Therefore, the EU should move towards a system of mandatory classification and ensure that smaller NGOs are subject to the same transparency standards applied equal to all. The balance in the oversight and autonomy of NGO must be carefully celebrated so that their combined effect ensure the highest possible level of transparency and compliance while not imposing excessive and administrative burden on small NGOs. Excessive regulation or reporting demands can divert limited resources away from their core activities, potentially leading to a decline in the number of diversity of cross organization. Importantly, equality in oversight does not necessarily mean uniform treatment. A risk-based and proportional oversight approach, widely applied in the supervision of various economic and financial sectors, could be also adopted to the NGO context. This principle may hold the key to fostering both accountability and independent civil society. One spoon of oil can drain a whole barrel of honey. This is a very sensitive matter, as the general public perceives NGO fundings as an expense made from their own pockets. There is nothing worse for people than the feeling that they might be deceived. Therefore, non-transparent EU funding for NGOs lead to major problems. First, it erodes trust in political institutions that allow such a lack of oversight to persist. And second, it undermines confidence in the very concept of NGOs as organizations working for a public good. So, going to the conclusions, reflecting to the report and to the broader EU legal context, it could be mentioned 3 priority directions for reform. First of all, the unified and enforceable legal definition of NGO across the Euro. Second, a systematic and preventive oversight mechanism for EU-funded NGO based on risk assessment and proportionality. And last, reliable, standardized data and clear procedure, ensuring transparency while respecting privacy and fundamental rights. And in the words of the European Court of Auditors, credible oversight begins with credible data. Let me add some additional remark and clear procedure. Then these conditions are met, then the law provides both clarity and fairness. The EU can foster a transparent, trustworthy and value-based NGO sector. I wish all fruitful discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Dear Jurgita, dear Professor, thank you very much for your very, how to say, very important, very interesting remarks and recommendations. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we have heard from all the panelists of the session, and now the time for our Q&A session, and Damien will take a lead, please.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. So indeed, we've done one round of questions already. Thank you to our chair. Now, I would like to appeal to everybody in the room, if you'd like to have any questions, to indicate this to us by raising hands. And those online, we have over 100 of those, please put your questions in the Slido, which for the moment is still empty. I'm sure that this is a very interesting debate also for you, and your feedback, of course, is very important to us. So please scan the QR code on the screen, or just click on the one that you have in the chat box. And in the meantime, I will just play a bit of a devil's advocate here. Now, I'll go back to the chair and, well, I remember also when we presented the report to the press and we got these questions, and, you know, just to get address the elephant in the room, I know that auditors are not policy or politics makers, but a question to you, dear Laima, should NGOs lobby in Parliament, Council and so on, and should they receive money for it?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very general question. But our understanding is the European Union wants to support NGOs because NGOs play a key role in ensuring democracy, in policy making, and in program implementation. And I think it's absolutely almost impossible, at least very difficult to imagine NGOs being involved in policy making without meeting and discussing issues with policymakers like the Parliament and the Council. So But after saying this, I have to say that what is important, that all these activities remain transparent. And in our second session of this conference, we will we'll address the issue of transparency register and that, for instance, those who would like to talk with the members of parliament, they should be registered. So, and as you know, the Court of Auditors recently published a special report on this, specific recommendations to improve the situation. But, I mean, if you are asking me, should NGOs receive money for lobbying? So my reply would be that it's not a question for auditors. It is for the EU legislators to answer. Thank you.
Well, excellent. I think you just threw the to Nicholas. Nicholas, what do you think?
Well, of course, as an MEP, I meet NGOs regularly. I meet, representatives of companies and everybody. And of course, NGOs will do NGO things. I mean, lobbying is part of their DNA, and of course, that's part of our political system. The question is, how are grant agreements done? And you mentioned it. And there's a different interpretation. If a grant agreement says, an operational grant agreement says, well, we are going to meet this and that person and we are going to advocate for that, and on the same grant agreement it says, and you will probably argue, well, that's a work program that we gave to the, and you're obliged to give the work program to the Commission, and that's part of the agreement. But if this is in the same agreement, it sounds pretty peculiar, I would say, because of course you have to explain to the taxpayers, why is there a NGO receiving money for advocating against, for example, I don't know, Mercosur, while Commission on the other hand is working for it and Parliament is working on it, and then you have a grant agreement saying we give money to an NGO and the NGO is going to lobby, and very concrete steps of lobbying against it. For the taxpayer, that's hard to comprehend, probably, also for MEPs. And so therefore and another point is, these grant agreements are kept as, secrets. It's like there's no transparency really at all, and some of them, have been, seen the light in the press and in press releases. And there's nothing, from my point of view, there's nothing really secret in it. So that will be the first step of transparency to be open on these grant agreements. Why not? And a lot of conspiracy theories and mistrust around these grant agreements and so on, would vanish if we would just make it transparent. So, of course, I don't want Commission to pay for lobbying activities towards Parliament. We are the ones who control Commission, not the other way around. So we need to be very clear that this does not happen in the future. Another question related to this that I'm asking myself, how is it going to be in the future? I mean, one regulation, for example, that was responsible for all these misunderstandings and confusion and everything around it is a life regulation, where also the regulation itself is difficult, because it also calls for NGOs to enforce EU law, which is difficult, politically difficult, to call for a third party to enforce EU law. That is, of course, a job for the Commission. And but are we going to have a life regulation in the future with the next MFF and the new structure of the proposed structure of the MFF? If member states are responsible for this in the future, that gives us a new headache. And therefore, of course, to make a long story short, of course, I don't want the Commission to pay for lobbying towards the Parliament, and we need to make sure that this impression is not given, because at least of the reputational risk that the Commission also acknowledges.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas. But I would just like to continue on this point that you're making. In that case, I mean, if I understand that, should lobbying and then advocacy activities then funded by EU grants, should they be subject to more rigorous disclosure rules even? And concretely, what form could they or should they take? Yes, and then perhaps we can continue with other speakers. Just a very short follow-up on your...
Well, the grant agreements have to make sure that they are formulated in a way that there's no direct link between the Commission and lobbying activities towards Parliament, most of all. And we should make those grant agreements very transparent so that everybody can see what are the NGOs doing and how much money do they receive. And I think that would also be for the benefit of the NGOs.
Okay, very good. If any of the other panelists would like to have a replica or would like to comment on what Nicola has just said, please do so. Otherwise, I will just perhaps then continue with Michael, because I think Nicolas also addressed a little bit the Commission. You stated the Commission's commitment in several areas before, but what lessons could the EU draw from, let's say, other international organizations or governments in terms of best practices for funding transparency and NGO oversight?
Well, on that I can't really reply because we don't have data on what other international organizations do.
Okay, well, that's very clear. Okay, then maybe another one. I'm still waiting if there will be any questions in the Slido. We have one. And please, if in the room you would like to ask a question, can you raise your hand so that I can see and I'll then give you the floor. And then, Michael, then perhaps another question for you. So let's say, given the lack of a centralized database, what practical steps could be taken immediately, because we were talking also what's coming in the future, to improve oversight and public access to information on EU-funded NGOs?
Well, it's really important for the time being to look at 3 sources of information, at the very least. The funding, the financial transparency system, which tells you about any beneficiary of EU grants or EU contracts, including NGOs, how much money do they get, with upgrades, improvements in how quickly this is put up to date ongoing. Then, if you want to know which of the Commission's programs and work programs specifically do fund advocacy, you look into the funding and tenders portal, with I take, of course, note of the analysis that the information provided there could be more detailed. And third, anyone, NGO or not, active in lobbying activities vis-à-vis the EU institutions must register in the transparency register, must there disclose sources of funding, and also disclose what they are doing. And if you link the 3, you can also very clearly see, unless someone misrepresents, but the cases to our knowledge are very few, where such misrepresentation may have happened. If you put the 3 together, you very clearly see which EU funding programs in the first place could possibly support advocacy activities. The LIFE program already mentioned is one that in the current multi-annual financial framework explicitly asks for civil society activities. We have now, following certain grant agreements with work programs where we ourselves concluded that they would could pose a reputational risk, provided guidance how this should be set up, and then if it is done, then that activity should be described in the transparency register. So that's, and we will hear later also where the future for the transparency register may go. So we think a lot is already ongoing, and maybe one thing to recall with respect to funding. Being an NGO or not, is in principle not a requirement for access to EU funding. There are very few work programs where it is, like the LIFE program, where it may be required that you have to be an NGO to qualify for the access to funding. And where this is the case, there would of course be a more specific check also whether the NGO status is actually fulfilled. Because if everyone can ask for a grant, and it doesn't make any difference whether you're a private sector company or not, what difference does it make whether even if you are wrongly classifying yourself as an NGO, what difference does it make for the grant agreement? It makes a difference for the statistics, but, and we're working on this now, having the NGO definition in the financial regulation. If needed, we will look into more guidance on the link to government or not. And maybe to finish there, it's also important to keep two things apart. One is independence from government, and another thing is receiving support from government. It is no surprise that the EU LIFE program, for example, specifically foresees operating grants for civil society organizations, because the analysis has shown that they need public money support. Now, whether the public support comes from a member state or from the EU budget is then a second level of discussion. But so there is no surprise in the finding that NGOs receive public support. Mostly, I would guess, I don't have the average data, from the member states or regions, etc. It's a different thing whether in their activities they're independent from government or not. Thank you.
Okay, that was very comprehensive. In the meantime, let me repeat, if anybody has a question in the room, please raise your hand. I think we have one here in the front. I will give you the floor just in a moment, just so that I know, but I will first of all just also like to hear from Gabriella and Jorgita some questions that just came up during their presentations. Gabriella, I mean, we've heard it already before also from other speakers, how important, let's say, funding autonomy is, and how can the EU ensure that, let's say, increased transparency requirements for NGO funding do not inadvertently stifle the important work that is carried out by these organizations?
I think simplification doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to lose robustness. And we as civil society stand ready also to work with media, with journalists and people who are interested in acquiring this data and acquiring this information. What would be the best ways to make it available, at what points in the cycles it should be available. And we think that simplifying some aspects of the whole process could make better and more timely information be available without impacting on quality. So I think this is something we can do. I think society expects civil society to be acting as checks and balances with our policymakers. I can't comment specifically on the Mercosur example, but I don't really agree that citizens would not expect public money to be used for civil society to be engaged in policy discussions with policymakers. Indeed, many of the funding programs, that's one of their central purposes, is to support civil dialogue, to support dialogue between citizens and policymakers. So I think citizens are very well aware that this is something that is needed as a central aspect of our democracy, and I don't think it's something that citizens are shocked by. I appreciate very much, Nicholas, that you said that this is not questions which are about attacking civic space or attacking civil society, and I believe from your side that this is the case, but unfortunately it's not the case across the member states. There are disinformation campaigns around what civil society is doing, leading to mistrust in civil society, eroding our democracy. And I think we just have to be very careful and very cautious that these very important decisions about trust and transparency, we don't get caught up and dragged into this other dynamic, which is about undermining civic space, undermining our democracy. And I think we just need to be very careful and cautious of that.
Excellent, thank you very much. And then maybe also for Jurgita, it's great to have also academic view here. And this has been mentioned also before, well, let's put it in inverted commas, scandals. Now, in the light of recent scandals and political debates, do you believe, I mean, you've spoken about what future reforms could be, should be, but do you believe the current reforms go far enough to restore the public confidence in the management of EU funds?
The starting position is that the non-governmental sector is not bad. It is our support is the main score for every society, and for European society, NGOs plays very important role. But the second question is, but still we need transparency, and we need the balance between the oversight and giving the money for this sector. Because we have the public interest of a society to know where our money goes and where we spend our contributions. And from my point of view, really, so we have enough trust in the society, into the NGOs, but we needed a little bit more better administration and better rules and better oversight, better collecting of data and analyzing them, and at the end to support the NGOs, or sometimes to say that we could, you made a mistake and we need to correct such a mistake. But the common trust, I suppose, is very good in this sector, and we need to keep this trust position, not to allow to overflow of disinformation or discrepant information.
Excellent, thank you very much. Now, we've seen some hands raised in the room. We have some questions in the Slido, so let's make this as interactive as possible, and then later, time permitting, we can maybe just close with final remarks, or maybe one question also from the chat to the speakers. In full transparency, we will prolong this session by 10 minutes, and we will just start next one 10 minutes later. So I think the gentleman here in the front room, if you could just state your name, organization that you represent.
Rimvidas Norkus, member of the Court of Justice of the European Union. Very interesting discussion, and I would like to raise a question concerning the values, the respective values of the European Union as a negative condition for the financement of NGO. It was mentioned that, and I think it would be really inconceivable that the NGOs who do not respect the values nevertheless are funded by the EU. It is fully in line with the case law of the Court of Justice, who has ruled on a number of occasions that EU values are not simple declarations, but they are real legal commitments of the member states. However, I was wondering how effective is this oversight in practice, given the very undefined and general nature of EU values as listed in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union. The case law of the Court of Justice has given some indications about the rule of law, but the list of values, which we can count as many as 12 in Article 2, is very broad: human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, justice, solidarity. So my question is there other examples in the oversight practice of the Commission that the funding has been denied, withdrawn due to lack of the respect of the values, and how feasible is this oversight? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think this goes to the Commission's representative, I think, and if anybody else would also like to comment.
Just first to explain the legal setup that we use. As part of the so-called model grant agreements, everyone, no matter whether NGO or not, must commit to respecting EU values. And if we find out that this is not the case, funding can be suspended, contract cancelled, money recovered. So we have the full gamut of protection facilities there. To my knowledge, there have been no cases where a grant beneficiary from the EU budget in direct management, because this is what we're talking about, has been identified for not respecting the contractual obligation to respect EU values and therefore funding withdrawn. But we have all the tools in place to react when ever, hopefully never, but if ever it was to happen, we have all the protection tools in case. That could now, with the more explicit exclusion grounds, for example, for incitement to hatred, if we find out that a grant beneficiary is involved to that, we would immediately take action to first investigate that and then see whether this conflicts with the obligations undertaken under the grant agreement and then draw the consequences.
If I may briefly to react to this, I think, very important question. During our audit, we took a closer look at 90 recipients, randomly selected from different EU programs managed under all three management modes. And in the end, we did not find a single case of non-compliance with EU values. Nevertheless, we need to keep in mind that we chose our sample from a pool of around 12,000 recipients who received EU funding. And the total number of NGOs, as we all know, across the EU is estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. That said, it's really important to have proactive checks. And that's what we speak about in our audit report, in our special report, given the potential reputational damage, that even one or two cases of non-compliance with EU values could cause the European Union. And I mentioned in my introductory remarks Qatargate case, which is still, repeated, which is still mentioned quite often. So, especially, when we live in the world of not politics, but geopolitics. So this is crucial for the EU's credibility, and that is how our audit team, how we looked at this issue. Thank you.
Excellent. I think we have a gentleman in the second row, and then we'll take a couple of very quick Slido questions. Then we can start wrapping up.
Thank you, Saulus Kaleda, EU General Court. And first of all, I would like to thank you for the presentation of this very important and I would say very timely report, given all the threats which EU values and our democracy are facing this time. The strong civil society, strong NGOs, it is an important pillar in this respect. I have a question which is a bit wider and touches upon an aspect which was mentioned by Professor Použaitė-Kulvinskienė. Because transparency, of course, it is very important. It underpins EU values. But when there is one side of the coin, there is usually the other side of the coin. And transparency in some situations must be balanced with the right to privacy, with the protection of personal data. So the Court of Justice had to consider this in a Lithuanian case, Vyriausioji tarnybinės etikos komisija, which was about the publication of private interest declarations, of conflict of interest declarations, by associations which receive funding, including EU funding. And there the Court of Justice said that Lithuanian transparency requirements went too far in giving public access to those conflict of interest declarations. Was this need to weigh, on the other hand, the privacy, on the other hand, transparency, did it come up in the discussion concerning the NGOs and the report? I know I'd like to hear perhaps from Madame Civico, who is our representative of civil society, and perhaps also of the drafters of the report.
Yes, absolutely. We have to balance. We are in a climate where civil society actors, fundamental rights defenders, are under attack. They are actually in danger. And of course, full disclosure and full publication of work plans, of details, of people working on specific files, on specific portfolios, could increase that climate of precariety for some people working in the civil society sector or volunteering indeed in the civil society sector. So absolutely we need to balance these facts. And as I've said, as Civil Society Europe, we are very happy to work hand in hand with all the actors in this topic to try to see how we can best strike that balance. It's also in our interest to show more clearly what we do, to show more clearly our added value around different areas of the EU work programme, and bringing EU values into practice, bringing the vision for the EU as a safe, democratic space where equality is thriving and all the other EU values are also thriving. So it's very much in our interest. We're very interested to find and try to strike the right balance. We spend a lot of time and energy trying to show what we do, actually, but in some specific cases, there is a need for some civil society actors to be a bit more discreet about what they are doing, what they are talking about, who they are talking to, because of the anti-democratic forces that we see on the rise around us in Europe, and this polarizing effect that we see around us in Europe, that we also have to be mindful of protecting people's personal interests and personal privacy and personal safety.
Very good. Thank you very much for the questions and answers. I will just read out a couple of you from the Slido. Some of them are addressed to specific speakers. So, for example, one for Mr. Herbst. I'll just read it out. What can be understood as a reputational risk specifically, and for whom? If grant agreements can support advocacy actions, while at the EU level, such advocacy will naturally target the co-legislators, MEPs, and the member states. So, Nicholas, one for you.
No, just to be very clear, the criticism on this does not go out to the NGOs, but to the Commission. The critical thing is that giving money to NGOs can, depending on how you read those agreements, can be linked to the financing by the Commission, and that is a problem. Of course, as I said, NGOs will do NGOs things. That's their job, that's their DNA, as I said earlier. The question is, can it be linked to the financing? And that's a big problem, and that's a reputational risk. I think reputational risk is also a wording that the Commission uses because, you know, I think you'll see your position somewhere in the middle between criticizing that it's done it all and therefore it's a very, probably a pretty vague wording. Nevertheless, the criticism does not go out to the NGOs, it goes out to the Commission because the financing can be linked, or could be, if you interpret it this way, can be linked to the work of the NGOs.
Thank you. I think there's another question about proactive checks. I think we've addressed that one, and one for the ECA. Any plans to prepare more audits in the field of transparency, either focused on other categories or recipients or other institutions? Of course, I can just upfront say, well, all of our audits are probably looking at transparency from different angles, and this audit was, of course, a follow-up on the previous one from 2018. And as a systematic follow-up, we will look at the area again 3 years from now, and we will also come up with a work program later this year and all other programs on annual basis. Now, we could, of course, look at the area probably again on this and possibly also include other recipients in that. I mean, one of our recommendations was on data checks and completeness. So on. So I don't know if Ms. Andrikien would like to add anything on this.
Damian, I can only repeat, what you rightly said, that before we started this audit, before it was included, it appeared on our work program. We took into account our stakeholders' interest, and we wanted to have a follow-up on our audit of 2018, which focused more on EU external policy, and now this time we focused on EU internal policy. And it ties with European Court of Auditors' main priority, boosting resilience to threats to the Union security, upholding European values of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. And We looked at whether the Commission has set up a solid framework for making funding for NGOs transparent in certain internal policy areas, which I mentioned in my introductory speech.
Okay, and I think Jan Gregor, also the Dean of our Chamber for Financing EU, would like to add something.
Thank you very much, Damian. I think I should add that we have made a special review on the future MFF that we published shortly before the Commission published its own proposal, but nevertheless we try to act as guardians of the basic principles of public finance, and transparency is definitely one of them. So we have called for accountability and transparency in the use of EU funds. At the same time, we have stated that any simplification should not be at the expense of accountability and transparency. So we also called for a clear definition of functions of division of power between Commission and Member States, and definition of their supervision and control responsibilities. And that, of course, includes proper accountability and transparency. We will also keep focus during the preparation of our opinions on various pieces of legislation for future MFF, including, of course, the performance framework. And as well as our target in the recent years was the RRF, we will specifically focus on the traceability, and that's part of transparency in the RRF domain. So this is assumed to be published as a special task in March 26. So of course, indeed, we keep focusing on basic principles of public finance.
Excellent. I think that it is a very proper and fitting we ended on this note. So what's coming next from the European Court of Auditors in terms of transparency? So plenty, so watch this space. Now, having said that, I think we all earned a coffee break. So let's not make it a too long one, but 15 minutes will still be available for everyone. And let's try to gather in here 15 minutes past 11 for the next session on lobbying. Thank you very much for now. Okay, so thank you everybody for being back on time, and I think we're all ready to kick up off our second session today. Let's just rewind a little bit, remind everybody we are at the Transparency Conference by the European Court of Auditors. This morning we've heard from our institution's President Tony Murphy, from the European Parliament President Roberta Metsola, and the first panel on the transparency of EU funding chaired by Laima Andrikiene. And we will now talk about the second topic of today's conference, which is equally interesting and also very connected: lobbying of EU policymakers and the EU Transparency Register. And this session will be chaired by another member of the European Court of Auditors, Jörg Christian Petrovic. And let me just explain a few words about Mr. Petrovic. He is a member of our institution. He sits in our chamber 5, indeed, where he leads audits in the area of financing, indeed, and administering the European Union. And previously, he already had a lifelong career in finance, particularly as an auditor, including first deputy president of the Court of Audit of Republic of Slovenia, and the author of many publications also on budget, so really well placed to lead this second debate today. And let me just briefly introduce the full panel of our esteemed speaker on Mr. Petrovic's right. We will hear from them in a moment. Mr. Rafael Cargueno, Senior Policy Officer at the Transparency International EU. Great to have you here, Rafael. Mr. Fernando Florindo Gijon, who is the head of unit in the Secretariat of the Transparency Register by the Council of the EU. So great to have you here, Fernando. And Marco Baldoli, who is Vice President of Society of European Affairs Professionals, among others. So great to have you here, Marco, as well. Now, before we start a session which will surely be very interesting in terms of insights and views, I would like to invite our chair, Mr. Petrovic, to tell us more about the audit report for which he was responsible in this topic and which our institution published last year, but of course remains, as we could hear, very relevant today. So, dear Jörg, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Damian. Dear participants, warm welcome also from my side, especially to the panelists. In this panel, we will discuss the transparency of lobbying EU lawmakers, a subject that is both complex and crucial for maintaining public trust in the EU democratic process. I will start by providing some insights stemming from our 2024 special report on the EU Transparency Register. That is the main tool available at the EU level. But first, why is lobbying important? Lobbying allows organizations and individuals to provide input for policy and decision-making. As such, it is an essential democratic tool, but it is not without risks. And these risks should be adequately managed. Without transparency mechanisms, it can result in an undue influence, unfair competition, and even corruption. In our audit, we assessed the framework for lobbying EU lawmakers. We checked whether the arrangements were transparent for the public and whether they provide fair access for lobbyists. In particular, we examined whether the European Union's Transparency Register provided useful information to the public about who is lobbying the EU lawmakers. What did we find? On the positive side, the EU has come some way regarding the transparency of its lobbying activities. The fact that it has a transparency register, it's already a case in point. And we found that the register itself has positive features as it provides useful information to citizens about the potential influence of lobbyists. But there were also several aspects of which we were rather critical in our report. Most importantly, we found that lobbying EU lawmakers could still slip under the radar. This is because lobbyists could bypass the register for a range of interactions. And in these interactions, they could still influence EU lawmakers. This not only reduces the transparency, but also affects the public trust. Our message was straightforward. The EU Transparency Register had to be bolstered so that it would not turn into a paper tiger. Now let me go a bit into the details. The EU Transparency Register was initially established by the Parliament and the Commission by means of an interinstitutional agreement. The Council joined in 2021. That year, all three agreed on the so-called conditionality principle, which means that registration is a necessary precondition for lobbyists to be able to carry out certain activities. We are talking about scheduling a meeting with a commissioner or obtaining a badge to access the parliament, for example. We found that the interinstitutional agreement was broadly in line with international principles for transparency and integrity in lobbying. The three institutions were also taking steps to increase transparency and encouraging registration. As a result, the number of registered lobbyists has grown significantly over the years. On the other hand, the agreement does not set out minimum requirements how it should be implemented. The institutions have not even agreed on the common definition of what constitutes a meeting. The fact is that lobbyists had to register only for certain activities and meetings. For example, a non-governmental organization identified in Qatargate was not registered, but had co-hosted a conference at the Parliament in June 2022. An important fact is that the register is voluntary. It is based on the interinstitutional agreement, which is not an enforceable legal act. As such, it cannot give rise to penalties. We found that the enforcement measures to ensure the lobbyists comply with registration and information required fell short. The main enforcement measure available is removal from the lobbyists from the register. I would like to stress two other very important matters that we criticize in our report. Firstly, the lobbyists need to be registered only to meet the highest ranking staff. We are talking about the level of Director General upwards, which effectively excludes most of the staff. And secondary, only the pre-scheduled meetings were reported. This meant that the formal record did not need to be kept for spontaneous meetings, unscheduled phone calls, or email exchange. Therefore, a range of lobbying interactions with EU lawmakers could be hidden from the public eye. Another important point we made in our report is that the checks on the information declared by lobbyists need to be improved further. There is an example that connects well with the previous panel. We identified the risks that NGOs founded by third parties could avoid disclosing their funding sources. This was possibly if they stated that they are only representing their own interests or the collective interests of their members. Last but not least, the register website has significant drawbacks when it comes to providing sufficient information on key aspects of lobbying activities to allow for public scrutiny. So what did we suggest to improve the situation? We put forward four very clear recommendations to the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council. First, we recommended strengthening the register's framework. Secondly, we suggested that this institution publish information on non-scheduled meetings with the lobbyists. Thirdly, we recommended improving data quality checks. And finally, we suggested that the user-friendliness on the relevance of the public websites should be improved. Now, 1.5 years have passed since our report, and I think it's a good time to reflect on what has changed. We have seen already some promising developments. Since 1st of January this year, the European Commission has extended obligations to meet only registered lobbyists to all the management staff. This was, as said, one of our recommendations, which was by the time of the publishing of the report not accepted by the Commission, but we are glad to see that it was eventually implemented. In addition, the Commission now requires publishing minutes of the lobbying meetings. At the Parliament, the Bureau adopted the new rules in May 2025 that go in the same direction, with all managers required to meet only registered lobbyists and to declare scheduled meetings with lobbyists as well as with representatives and third countries' public authorities. Another improvement that we have seen concerns the Transparency Register. In June 2025, the Secretariat introduced new automatic financial cross-check between clients and intermediaries with the aim to catch mismatch. These are examples of promising development, but now I look forward to hear the perspectives of our panelists about the current situation with all its opportunities and the challenges. So, first back to you, Damian.
Thank you very much, York. Indeed, now as previously in the previous session, I think this opening speech sets the foundation for our talk ahead. And as we said before, auditors do ask questions first. So, York, as a chair, what would be your question to the three esteemed speakers?
I would start with the gentleman from Transparency Register, Mr. Fernando, and maybe because we are always interested, I already mentioned a couple of recent developments. Could you give us maybe your perspective and more insight into how the Transparency Register is evolving to address these different challenges that were highlighted?
Many thanks, and I'm certainly glad to participate in this panel, and thanks to the Court of Auditors for organizing it, in particular to Mr. Petrovic. Of course, I'm the coordinator of the Transparency Register, and I'm also head of unit in the Council, but when I express some personal views, and I will be clear when it is my views, it is not necessarily those of the Transparency Register or the Council. I think to start with, I mean, we need to take into account to differentiate the two parts, the two elements of how it works, our system, the interinstitutional agreement, which is one part, which is the database, which is just a very complete database of interest representatives. This is managed by the Transparency Register Secretariat, which ensures that all information provided by the interest representatives is complete and accurate. But the second element is the conditionality principle, which requires the signatory institutions and those institutional bodies that join afterwards to make certain activities conditional on the interest representatives. It is for the institutions, in this case the three institutions, to decide which activities and how they monitor them and how they publicize, if they publicize, those activities. I mean, there is in principle, no role for the Transparency Register Secretariat, apart from making it available in our webpage and presenting. Is it working? Because finally, this is and we recently, because we had the assessment that we were obliged by the interinstitutional agreement this year, and in May, on the basis of an assessment made by the Secretariat, the Management Board is the three Secretary Generals of the three institutions, concluded that the register remains suitable for the objectives sought by the institutions, but at the same time, the Management Board clearly noted that further improvements can be made and should be made within the context of the current legal framework. How you see that the Transparency Register is working? For me, probably the most interesting is the figures of the number of registrants. I mean, I checked it this morning, and it was 15,963. Probably by the end of the day or tomorrow, we will arrive to almost 16,000. It means that it is more 20% more than at the beginning of the year. So it is a huge increase. If you compare it with the previous year, so 1 year and a half, it's almost 30% more. Now we are getting more and more requests for participating, and I think it shows that in practice, interest representatives register in almost every case if they wish to interact with the institutions. We have, in my view, very, very few shadow lobbying, and we see very, very little. Even if it is true that in theory there are interactions that are not do not require to be registered, but they are so little that no real lobbyist could survive probably in Brussels if it is not registered. The second question is if we are providing with the Secretariat, meaning complete and accurate information on those registrants, and I think that's yes, but because it is the most important thing, I will come later maybe, and in particular during the questions and answers probably. A restriction, which I think we should have in mind also when discussing. I mean, when we think about lobbying and how lobbying should be, immediately we think about two different ideas, transparent and ethical. By ethical, we mean that our authorities must act within independence, meaning that only in the public interest and avoiding any possible conflict of interest. But it also means that both the authorities and the interest representatives must act with integrity. The Transparency Register is certainly a tool to ensure transparency. Only that transparency is, of course, very, very important. I mean, for sure, transparency creates an incentive, a strong incentive for ethical behavior and for compliance with ethical standards, and also facilitates very much the uncovering of bad practices. So certainly it is very important, but it is enough? And my answer would be that not. I mean, we need also ethic standards applied to the institutions, obviously, their members and their staff. And in this, certainly the future ethics body may have an impact, or so I expect. In this context, the role of the Secretariat, it is important, but it is also modest. It is to ensure the quality of the data in the register, that all the interest representatives provide all the important information, particularly the financial information, and that anyone who is not providing those data is removed immediately from the register. How do we carry that task? Checks and checks, a massive number. I mean, first, the most important, when interest representatives apply to register, the Secretariat checks that they have provided all the required information and that, based on a preliminary assessment, it is accurate. It is a serious check. For you to have an idea, approximately only around a quarter of those applying get registered immediately. For about 50%, a little less, after replying to requests from the Secretariat for providing further information, amending the information, or providing clarifications, they get registered, and around 25% and 30% do not get registered, or their applications are rejected for not complying with the required standards or for not being eligible. In addition, for those who are already in the register, we do targeted checks. De facto, we do two different types of targeted checks. I mean, some of them to categories of registrants or characteristics of some registrants that seems to imply a higher risk. And second, we do some targeted checks also to ensure that any registrant is checked at least every 3 years. This was a commitment to a recommendation by the European Court of Auditors, and that we are already implementing. For you to have an idea, in 2024 we carried out almost 8,000 checks on registrants. This year, until last week, we had done almost 7,200. Certainly by the end of the year we will have done a higher number than the previous year of checks. Obviously, our checks cannot uncover any inaccuracy or mistake in the information provided by the registrant and which is submitted under their own responsibility. But the publicity of that information makes it easier to uncover any inaccuracy. We receive regularly input from many NGOs and watchdogs, also from interest representatives themselves, and we always, the Secretariat always follows up on every complaint or information which is submitted to us. This allows us to believe that while the data provided by the Transparency Register is probably not perfect, it is of a high quality in terms of completeness and accuracy. And I will certainly be very, very glad to develop all those ideas in your questions. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Now I go to you. Rafael, you are coming from Transparency International. It's in the very core of your organization to promote transparency in the public activities. And following these discussions today in both panels and my presentation and what was just said from Fernando's side, the current situation and the efforts to improve, how do you see them? Are they enough?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, and good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing fantastically well. Thank you also on behalf of Transparency International for inviting us to this great panel to discuss, which I think is my favorite subject in Brussels, lobby transparency. Just a little word about myself. I've been doing this for nearly over a decade, and really, truly, we've come a very long way. So I would commend the EU institutions for the progress made. But I would also like to take you a little bit back into history, all the way back to 2014, which we consider to be the actual birth moment of the Transparency Register as we know it today. So in 2014, we were at the beginning of the Juncker Commission, and Mr. Juncker was already facing a very serious ethics scandal. His predecessor, Mr. José Manuel Barroso, decided right at the end of his mandate to work for Goldman Sachs. Now, of course, when we think in 2014, we're still reeling from the financial crisis, and so the public perception is extremely negative about this. And that meant that Mr. Juncker had to really take a very strong decision and to clarify the rules of engagement between the EU institutions, and specifically the Commission, and lobbyists. And he took two monumental decisions. The first decision is the establishment of the conditionality principle as we know it today. That is actually creating an element, a mandatory element to the Transparency Register. If you want to have a meeting at the highest level, that is with Commissioner, Director Generals and Cabinet members, you have to be on the Transparency Register. And the effect of this was really immediate because in the space of 1 month, we went from 4,000 registration to 8,000 registration. So in the space of 1 month, the register doubled in number. It also meant that lobbyists actually took this register seriously because the information that they provided significantly improved in quality. And from that moment onwards, for Transparency International, we saw that this was a very good system, not only to try to capture all lobbyists that seek to influence the decision-making process, but we also had the publication of meetings which allowed us for the first time ever to see the lobbying dynamics at the highest level of the European Commission, and also to understand maybe if there's a relationship between, for example, the resources that lobbyists have and the access that they could get, but also simply to understand which organizations had most impact on the legislation. And if we fast forward to today, we've really come a long way because when we talk about the publication of meetings, as Mr. Petrovic explained, this has been extended to the managers of the European Commission. So significantly more officials are now publishing. When it comes to the European Parliament, today all MEPs and their assistants must publish their lobby meetings, and the European Parliament also applies a certain level of conditionality. This one is a little bit different. It concerns if you have to organize, or if you're organizing events inside the European Parliament, or if you're testifying in a committee hearing, you have to be on the Transparency Register. And when it comes to the Council, we actually have a piecemeal approach, but nearly half of all permanent representations, which are the institutions that are targeted by lobbyists, apply either the conditionality principle or publish their lobby meetings. And so when we look at the situation today, we have over 2,000 officials that publish their lobby meetings, 2 institutions that apply conditionality principle, and 1 that does it a little bit more piecemeal. And if we look simply at the data, it is actually quite impressive because just for this mandate alone, so if we talk for the second von der Leyen mandate, we have already 16,000 meetings since the 1st of December 2024. If we look at the European Parliament, since the beginning of the mandate, we have over 40,000 meetings. So there is really a tremendous amount of information that is publicly available, and that is the transparency element, and I think on that front we're doing very well. But of course, lobbying framework is not just about transparency. It is also about the integrity, about the interactions between the decision makers and the lobbyists. It is really rules that are designed to prevent undue influence and conflicts of interest, and it's on that element that we need to work a lot more. Now, first, before I get to that, just maybe a couple of areas of improvement on the EU Transparency Register itself. Now, there is a lot of important information available, but there are very different reporting requirements depending on the category of organizations. So commercial entities and non-commercial entities do not report the same financial aspect. Non-commercial entities report their total global operating income, and when I mean global, I mean worldwide, whereas commercial entities only report the lobbying budget. And so, of course, now we are comparing apples and oranges. It is simply not possible to understand the different types of resources that are allocated to EU lobbying. There's also a data gap because all entities that are receiving grants, and this is commercial and non-commercial, must report it on the EU Transparency Register, but we do not have the data related to EU procurement. And for example, we have a number of service contracts that have public policy implications, and it would be vitally important that we also have that information so that we can understand and have a total picture of what's happening on that front. And finally, one little point about the enforcement part is that we now, if I understand correctly from the data this morning, that we have 16,000 organizations by the end of the day, and we only have 11 full-time equivalents that are dedicated to verifying the information and making sure that the code of conduct is correctly applied. So we would really argue that significantly more resources must be allocated to the Secretariat, both for investigations, but also to make sure that organizations that do not respect the code of conduct are properly sanctioned. So moving on to very quickly to the undue influence aspects. We have really, in the number of years, a number of scandals that have hit the EU institutions, and in particular also the European Parliament. Everybody is well aware of the Qatargate scandal, more recently the Huawei scandal. Each of these scandals has prompted, well, especially the Qatargate scandal, has prompted a reform process that had the opportunity to close loopholes, integrity loopholes inside the European Parliament, and unfortunately this was not done. One of the key aspects that really needs to be urgently addressed is the problem of conflicts of interest. Members of the European Parliament are allowed to have side activities with very little limitation as to the nature of that activity, and the amounts involved. There is a general ban on not being engaged in paid lobbying activities, but there is no definition of what paid lobbying activities actually means. And if we look at the data that we collect and the declarations of private interest, we found 180 side activities with organizations that are on the Transparency Register. For some of these are paid activities, and going a level further, for some of these, the MEPs in question are legislating in the exact same field of interest that that organization is defending. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there is a conflict of interest, but we must really be clear that the risk is very high. And so therefore it's absolutely vital as a first point of order that we ban side activities with any organization that has as its objective to influence the EU decision-making process. On top of that, we would also look a bit at the cooling off period, because the European Parliament has introduced now a cooling off period after the Qatargate scandal, and it's a cooling off period of 6 months only. So it's only within 6 months that an MEP has to notify about the new employment after the end of their mandate. Now, of course, 6 months is really not enough, and we would really say that there it's vitally important to just harmonize with what's done within the European Commission of a cooling off period of at least 2 years, which is also in line with international recommendations that are defended by the OECD and the Venice Commission from the Council of Europe. Now, when it comes also to the conditionality principle that we rightfully mentioned, we would also say that harmonization would really be the best approach. No meeting, no registration, no meeting. Because right now, organizations that are not on the Transparency Register can actually meet with members of the European Parliament without disclosing who they are. And that obviously creates a very strong integrity and undue influence issue. Just to give you a very clear example, we've actually noticed in the data now an uptick in organizations that are very closely linked with the MAGA movement in the United States. One such organization called the Heritage Foundation, which is the author of the Project 2025 program in the United States, has met several times with members of the European Parliament and is not on the transparency register. And this is perfectly legal at this moment. And of course, we would really want to know this type of organization, what all the information, who they represent, what are their sources of funding, what are their advocacy points, and this is vitally important for everyone. And it's also vitally important that harmonizing the conditionality principle across all three institutions, and it would also include permanent representation here, would ensure that we capture every single organization that tries to influence the decision-making process. There would be no more gaps. Everybody would be transparent, and everyone would be also bound by the code of conduct that is from the transparency register. Now, there are some good news and maybe also some more negative news as to the situation today. The good news, and as was mentioned before, is that most of these reforms can be taken by the EU institutions themselves today. We don't have to wait, and most certainly we do not have to wait until the next scandal. And this is a bit unfortunate because in my experience, these reforms only happen after a scandal, and I think in this day and age, in the geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in, with rising Euroscepticism, we cannot afford another ethics scandal at EU level. The also positive element is that I talked a lot about harmonization of the different rules between EU institutions, and there is a vehicle today that is being set up, which is the EU ethics body, whose mandate is specifically designed to do just that. And we're still 1 year since the start of the mandate, and we're still waiting for this body to start operating, and we have no idea at this stage when we actually will do so. And that points a bit to the negative aspect, is that unfortunately we do not have the political will today to do this reform. And it is a bit of a shame because there's also a very positive aspect as to the progress that the EU institutions have done. I've observed in the nearly decade of work that I'm doing there, a number of reforms at member state level, and every single time that national authorities contact me, they want to know what is the example in Brussels. They look to the EU institutions for examples, and that means that it's vitally important when member states reform their national lobbying framework that we get it right here. And the reforms are not just happening in member state level. Right now, in the last 2 years, we had registers coming online in Germany, in Czech Republic, in Cyprus, and we have currently discussions in Italy and Spain. But it is also a requirement for enlargement countries. Every single enlargement and accession countries must adopt a lobby transparency framework, and they will look to Brussels for inspiration. So I would say that today we have a chance to achieve an adequate framework that fosters transparency between the lobbyists and the policymakers and the interactions, but also enforces adequate safeguards against undue influence and conflicts of interest. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Raphael. That was really interesting to hear the perspective of the organization who is doing the transparency for a long, long time. I'm glad that you actually brought so much interesting information and so much on the positive side, but I also thank you for all these risks that you have mentioned. We have definitely made a note, not just myself, but I'm sure also the other stakeholders. But now I would like to go to the perspective from the interest representatives. So, Marco, what's your assessment of the current arrangements for interacting with representatives of the EU institutions?
Thank you very much for the question, and thanks a lot for having me today. It's really an opportunity and an honor to be here, and on behalf of the Society of European Affairs Professionals, and for me personally, I'd like to thank you for this. I listened carefully to today's morning session that reminded us that transparency, accountability, and public trust are interdependent pillars of sound governance. Transparency enables accountability, and accountability is what sustains public trust. The European Union is a unique political system, is designed as a governance model. The institution must rely also on knowledge and evidence coming from civil society, academia, social partners, and the private sectors. By means of example, it helps us to remind that the European Commission, which proposes legislation for over 450 million citizens, employs around 32,000 officials, which by comparison is roughly the same number of municipal employees of the city of Rome. Given the scope of its responsibility, it is clear that the input from civil society is a fundamental component of our legislative process at EU level. Interest representation or lobbying is therefore not just an anomaly, but an integral part of EU governance. And precisely because lobbying is necessary, transparency becomes indispensable. Citizens are entitled to know who seeks to influence policy, in whose interest, and with what resources. The EU Transparency Register is the main instrument ensuring this visibility. It provides a single framework where registrants disclose their objectives, membership, clients, and budgets, and they commit to follow a code of conduct. As SEAP, we represent the community of public affairs professionals who operate within this framework: associations, NGOs, consultancies, and in-house practitioners. So we fully support both the transparency rules and the principle of conditionality. Structured engagement with the EU institutions should require prior registration and adherence to clear ethical standards. We therefore view the register not as a burden, but as a tool that safeguards institutional integrity and strengthens trust. Over the years, SEAP has also gathered extensive feedback from its members, and many of their observations align closely with the findings highlighted in the European Court of Auditors report. There is broad recognition that tangible progress was made in strengthening transparency and accountability, and that the Transparency Register remains a cornerstone of these efforts. When implemented in a balanced and coherent way, it helps to ensure openness, improve public trust, and reinforce the credibility of EU decision-making process. However, there are also areas that call for further reflection and adjustment. Transparency works best when it's balanced, consistent, and genuinely useful. And some of the most recent adjustments have shown that this balance can sometimes be disrupted. Our members often point to a few elements that should be preserved or improved, which include greater consistency in application of the rules. This also includes recent changes in minutes taking that it's been done, for instance, at Commission level. Clarity and predictability with any new requirements that is implemented or introduced to be explained clearly to the public. And I'm referring, for instance, to recent changes in the European Parliament, in the access to the premises of the European Parliament. Changes were communicated quite abruptly and with no prior consultation with the civil society. Smart and transparency, which means also trying to prioritize quality over quantity. And I refer also to the paper tiger, as it was mentioned before. And I cannot stress this enough, continued dialogue between institutions and civil society in ways that we can improve together in how we define rules, how we define and design the rules for increased transparency. SEAP and its members remain fully committed to transparency, but we also believe it must be designed in a way that it works. So a framework that strengthens accountability without reducing access, and that values genuine engagement over procedural box-ticking. As I mentioned before, information needs to flow better from institution to civil society and the other way around, of course, because the lack of dialogue risks widening the distance between institutions and the stakeholders they rely on. We must insist on a process that supports structured dialogue and does not increase the distance by adding administrative burdens that especially penalize smaller actors who do not have the same means or resources as larger organizations. That said, we should not forget that an essential component of the Transparency Register is its code of conduct. It defines how transparency translates into behavior: honesty, accuracy, respect for institutions, and the prohibition of improper influence. From SEP's perspective, this is the ethical backbone of the entire system. It ensures a level playing field where all organizations, companies, NGOs, trade unions, or universities are held to the same standards of integrity. We also believe that mutatis mutandis, all actors participating in EU lawmaking are, in fact, engaging in lobbying activities. Recognizing that reality and applying equivalent ethical standards to everyone reinforces fairness and credibility. Public affairs professionals remain firmly committed to transparency and accountability. These are values we promote through our own SEAP code of conduct and training activities. But we also have a responsibility to remind policymakers that transparency measures should not unintentionally become what creates more distance between institutions and citizens they serve. Transparency must enable access, not restrict it. As the EU continues to refine its transparency framework, SEP will continue to cooperate with institutions and civil society to ensure that transparency remains what it was meant to be, a bridge between institutions and citizens and not a barrier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. So much for the moment from my side. Now back to you, Damian.
Thank you very much, all speakers. So I'll play the devil's advocate a little bit more so in this session. And in the meantime, please, anybody who'd like to ask a question, please already indicate this to me, raising your hand so I can give you the floor later on. And those connected online, there are still over 100 of those, which is very good. If you can scan the QR code or click on it, and you are welcome to submit your questions in writing in the slider. We'll take them afterwards. Now, I'd like to get back to you, I think, Georg, first. You said that the Transparency Register had to be bolstered so that it wouldn't be turned into a paper tiger. So there's a risk of a paper tiger, but was it or is it a paper tiger?
No, I definitely would not call it that. We said it's a risk becoming one, but with all the improvements, it's a proper tool. We have also heard just right now the call from the lobbying side to not make too much of red tape, to really stick on the quality or the quantity or the engagement, not just box ticking, as it was said. But it's also important to keep all this information on the same level for everybody. This is definitely something that already back when we published the report, we constantly reiterate that no exceptions are a good example, because we mentioned that in the report that we have found that, for example, there is a loop in the legislation for some NGOs that declare that they are representing only themselves about the declaration of their sources of funding. We know that if the sources are coming from the European budget, they have to be declared. This is a step in the right directions. But in the current geopolitical situation, we would really like to know who is behind, who is financing the NGOs who are lobbying our legislatives in Brussels. So that's why this information about the sources of finance, it's very, very, very important. Yeah. So much.
Okay, but perhaps just to stay on what you've just said, how is it? Why can NGOs just click the right boxes, if we put it that way, and avoid disclosing financial information? Is this a loop in legislation, or could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, we cannot say it's legislation. It's this interinstitutional agreement. That's not legislation. Yeah, but that's the fact. There is some example of a loop. Yes.
Okay, perhaps go in that order that we started with Fernando, then from the Transparency Register. I think you said also there's a very little shadow lobbying. Perhaps before we go to your speakers, let me just read what we've at the European Court of Auditors said when we published the report. It said, for example, a non-governmental organization identified in Qatar Gate was not registered but had co-hosted a conference at the Parliament in June 2022. So just in that framework. Then maybe a question for you. What measures have EU institutions taken to strengthen transparency following the Qatar Gate? Could you give us any overview? Yeah, this one was for Fernando.
I wouldn't say that it was only because of the Qatar Gate. Certainly it will be difficult to put. I mean, certainly a lot of measures have been taken. I mean, in particular in the Qatar Gate, I remember perfectly, it was the Parliament. And just coming to the example, it is obvious that the monitoring of the meetings in the Parliament was greatly improved afterwards. It was one of the measures that the President of the Parliament proposed and carried out after this scandal, the famous 14 points. Much more on what has improved. I mean, indeed, we have. I mean, all the institutions have greatly strengthened the requirements for both conditionality and publication. I mean, in the meantime, Commission and Parliament very recently. I will comment on the Council because it is the institution for which I work. I mean, in the Council, conditionality applies to all civil servants. I mean, everyone until now. Simply, the obligation to report is only for the top management. But anyhow, every civil servant and every civil servant must consult the hierarchy if needed. How we are improving the data that not only NGOs, I mean in general, every registrant must present. As I mentioned, the only possibility we have is to do more checks and certainly publicity. I mean, it will be impossible and it will not be feasible to imagine an audit of every one of the registrants. I mean, would it not? So certainly the only possibility is that, of course, they have a responsibility. And I think my experience, whenever we have opened an investigation, it has always been that registrants are really afraid of the possibility of being removed, which is something that has happened in very few cases. Because cooperation has been very strong, and clearly for any one of those organizations, we have seen immediately that it was, even in difficult cases where it was obviously difficult, they have told us directly, sorry, I'm not sure. I thought this was properly implemented, but if you think we can improve, we will do it immediately. And it was the case. So clearly, no, let's say, important organization can today afford not to be in the Transparency Register or being removed in the Transparency Register. So, of course, we are improving our guidance. I hope you have, it has not been mentioned, but it is also very important because very often not some inaccuracies is probably not intentional. It is simply that it is not so obvious how to report very specific financial information. And we are regularly improving our guidance to the citizen. As I mentioned it, certainly we cooperate quite a lot with NGOs organizations that regularly feed information on us about what they think it is not properly. We always check, and depending on the outcome, I mean, we certainly take measures. Many. Yeah.
All right. I think you mentioned, just to follow up on that, I think earlier you mentioned that you would check on every registrant at least within 3 years. Do you plan any additional more automated checks, given the fact that, okay, we will soon live in the age of AI and we will only be part of that as spectators. Is there anything else coming in that domain?
Yes, we do quite a lot of things. Certainly, as Rafael mentioned it, we certainly will be glad to have more resources, and this is something that happens millimetrically, obviously, because there are quite other criteria in our authorities on how to allocate resources, but certainly we have increased it. It is a bit more than 11, but obviously, certainly it takes a lot. What we are doing is a lot of improvements, of course, on IT. I mean, it was mentioned how to link the grants to our database, so to detect automatically if something was not declared. Because of the new tool of the Commission, we are now launching a new feasibility study of how technologically could be done, and we are not even sure that it could be done, but at least we are trying. We are also trying, of course, of applying a new tool on artificial intelligence, which will automatically also call our attention to any inconsistencies between the data reported by the different registrants. And for instance, again, recently we developed again a tool, an IT tool, to immediately check the persons that the registrants were declaring in the European Parliament in order to get a pass, access to the premises, and the number of persons that they were declaring in the transparency register, to be sure that, again, that there is, to detect any possible inconsistency. So we have certainly a process ongoing on reviewing our working methods and our IT tools to make much more automatic the detecting or the uncovering of any inconsistencies or inaccuracies in the data submitted by the registrants.
Yes, please, Jörg.
Yeah, speaking of data and the web page and the availability and the user friendliness, maybe a question for the two of you. For your side, if you want to do some analysis, when we tried to do the audit, we figured it out that it's not quite a user-friendly tool if you want to filter out something or if you want to do some analysis. And from the perspective of the public scrutiny, this is important. It's not just your organization, it's also some journalists or anybody else who would like to go in the register and do some analysis. For Mr. Fernando, is there any view in the improvement, or what's on the schedule about this artificial intelligence coming in? It would be a missed opportunity to leave the register in some ancient platform or something with so many new developments in the AI area.
I mean, I will not commit to a timetable. This is a project still very, very initially, and it is being led by the Parliament IT team. But our intention is certainly to have something in not more than 1 year, but I'm not sure how much it will take. What I will mention is that certainly we try also, and we have done, because it was a request again from civil society organizations, to make available all our data. So all our data are available on XLM, so that you have, and you can see there are, I mean, I will not make publicity, but you have some organizations providing analysis on our data, because we share all of them. I mean, it is in our interest, and certainly we have cooperated to be sure that our data can be downloaded by them and exploited in the way they prefer. And you have some experiments, if you check in the web, of organizations that are doing. So this is also part of our. We try to present in the most in what we think it is a user-friendly way. I'm certainly open to consider how we could improve that. But at the same time, we certainly make the data available to other organizations to present them in the way they consider more interesting. And you have certainly this experiment going on.
And to complement that, one of the organizations that requested that data to be made available was, of course, Transparency International. And so it's true that today, when we look at from the data side, we do have the full transparency register and the full list of meetings from the Commission side available in open data. And this is information that, of course, we use in a platform called Integrity Watch EU, which I would highly encourage that you check, where you can basically sort, rank, and filter in a very interactive and user-friendly manner the information that is provided by the EU institutions. Now, Obviously, always more can be done. One thing that would be really great to have is to have the minutes in open data formats, which is not the case at the moment, so that's a direct request today. It's also vitally important that the European Parliament significantly improves its own data portal, because right now it's very limited in terms of the meetings and, of course, also the declarations of interest. Now, I would like to just come back 2 seconds to some of the 2 points that were mentioned a little bit earlier on, if I can, like about the categorization of organization, and so that everybody is really clear about what we're talking about. There are 3 main categories on the Transparency Register, and they really concern the interests represented. So there's one when it says represent their own interests. This concerns commercial entities. But of course, the entities represent commercial entities can also be non-profit organizations themselves. So they can be trade and business associations that are legally registered non-profit under Belgian law, but they represent commercial interest, and so naturally speaking, they would register in that category, and that actually means that we do not have all the sources of funding. This is actually the case for 95% of all business organizations that are registered on the Transparency Register, where we have absolutely no clue what their sources of funding are. Now, the second point that is vitally important is that for those that do inadvertently, or maybe advertently, who knows, register in the wrong category, this is where really the verification mechanism comes into place to make sure that everybody registers correctly. And I would also give maybe a second step of advice is that the guidance note in this regard on the Transparency Register is rather vague. So it would be really great to actually have a lot more information and guidance for registrants to make sure that everybody is under the correct registration. Now, of course, also one way to just overcome this problem is just to demand everyone to disclose their sources of funding, which would basically overcome this kind of differences in registration in different categories. Thank you.
Raphael, we have discussed this loophole, let's call it this way. We have also discussed the penalization. There is practically none except removal from the register. And in your expose, you have mentioned that accession countries, they need to fix this in their legislation. And Damian's question was, is this a loop in legislation? And I said, no, because it's an interinstitutional agreement. What's your opinion about this? Would it be necessary for the European Union? You said we need to be like an example to the accession countries, and some of the countries have already introduced the legislation on lobbying, the legislation on the registers. Should European Union go to this level? And maybe this will be also the question for Mr. Herbst later on to comment. Is there any intention going in this way? Is there a discussion going from institutional agreement maybe to some legal framework in the field of lobbying? What's your opinion?
I mean, this is certainly a very relevant point, because it is true that we might find ourselves down the line in the future in a situation where some accession countries will actually be more advanced than the system that we have in Brussels. And one of the key aspects that we've been advocating for as Transparency International and civil society colleagues is to have an independent oversight authority that would oversee not only the Transparency Register, but would also oversee the rules of engagement with lobbyists, including the side activities and the revolving door. There are some member states that have already adopted such a system. The one that comes to mind is in France with the High Authority for Transparency in Public Life. And the original vision for the EU ethics body was exactly this. That is an independent authority that has the means to investigate, that is also not just to investigate, but also the means to advise. It's not just only about sanctioning, but it's also about proactive information to either the lobbyists or to the policymakers about what can and cannot be done. Now, if it comes to sanctioning, right now, if we really want a system that works correctly, then the harmonization of the conditionality principle would be the best way to do so. Because, as Fernando rightfully explained, to be deregistered it means, for in certain instances, that you simply cannot have any contact, at least of the scheduled variety, with the EU institution. And as a lobbyist, you would simply be incapable of doing your work. Now, whether there should be sort of a gradual and maybe even going to a system where the penalties become a bit higher, that's something to see a little bit for the future, because I would say that first we should get all the points in order, we get the basic system in place, and then afterwards we can maybe see for an evolution on that front.
Okay, so Mr. Herbst, dear Nicholas, maybe a comment from the Parliament side. Is there any activities in this direction?
You know, you caught me off guard because I just came in after I left for 5 minutes, but I think the question was concerning the accession countries, if they should...
No, the question was that currently some European countries have introduced the legislation on the lobbying. On the European level, we have only this interinstitutional agreement. And it's a weak position because it's not enforceable. The only tool is to remove the lobbyists from the register. Because in some countries, if there are some illegal lobbying activities, the penalties are quite high. Is there any discussion on the European level, or is somebody starting to think in this direction to maybe introduce really something into the legal frame of European Union, not just having an interinstitutional agreement? That's the question. If there are any information in this direction that you would know.
I think you have to bear in mind the special composition of what we're doing in Brussels. I don't have any issues with having a legally more binding system in place. That's not the problem here. So the content is what matters in the end, basically. But you have to bear in mind how we came to this agreement, and that we are having a special role there in Brussels. So but I wouldn't be so negative on what we're doing in Brussels comparing to. You are right. There are some countries, even accession countries, who have go further. But we do also have member states who are not that far. So we are somehow in the middle. If I remember, for example, the country that I know best, we are still talking about a transparency register for the German Bundestag. So we are not that bad as it may seem.
All right, well, the discussion is already very lively. Let me just remind everybody this is not an audit, but it's very good that we have auditors' questions and everybody's feedback on that. That's the point of this conference. If there are any hands, any questions in the room, please just raise your hand. So far, none on Slido either. So let me just go on. Then maybe we can turn to Marco to have a look at the point of view from the interest representative. I mean, I think you said that the transparency register is useful tool. It's not a burdensome tool in that respect. Maybe not these words exactly. But let's say, how would stricter transparency rules, let's say disclosure of all contacts or funding sources, affect interest groups' ability to engage with EU institutions?
Do I understand correctly, specifically on fundings, or in general?
All contacts, all funding sources.
No, as I said before, I think from our perspective that interinstitutional agreements that set stricter rules and introduced the principle of conditionality was important way forward, and in a way to improve also trust in interest representatives before the institutions, to have more credibility. Complying with such rules gave us the opportunity to have basically, as I said before, more credibility in terms of who our members. I'm talking about, by means of example, an association, a trade association. You can disclose your members. You understand who you work with, also in terms of consultancies that might support the activities in the lobbying activities. So it's a number of information that were not there before. And I think that what we perceive at a certain point, CEP was established in 1997. We have a code of conduct, but clear rules clearly help in terms of framework. And there is a clear indication from our members that we would very well disclose even more information when it's required. And if there is need in terms of framework. Providing more information about our financials, providing more information about the meetings, nature of the meetings is all very welcome. What we fear is implementation. What we feel like sometimes might be a little bit of what was called before red tape, but might be also preventing, I don't want to say something too strong, but in certain cases it feels like almost too much transparency is killing transparency. Which means that if you end up in a situation where civil servants need to report the minutes of the meetings you're having, for instance, at commission level, we're seeing like the first publication of such minutes, and we're seeing that sometimes the report of the meeting is one sentence, sometimes it's more detailed. So where is the rule there? Why sometimes we have the perception that there might be moments where the workload is higher and officials might be more reluctant in granting immediately a meeting because of the backlog, because of the practical rules that were established in order to preserve transparency, but end up damaging it. So what I mean is like, the quality is definitely the criteria we're looking at in terms of improving transparency, and we need to do it bearing in mind what might be potential consequences from a practical point of view, which is, for instance, something I just explained with the minutes. And another example is what happened, and I maybe, because this is something that SEP brought to the attention of the general public a few years back, but what happened with the Who is Who register. We know that there are privacy reasons for removing the names of technical officials from the Who is Who register, but that was, in a way, for the civil society, a huge setback in terms of access to information of the civil servants we work with. Now, it is still possible to access this information by asking the head of unit, by calling the managers in the European Commission, but for smaller associations that sometimes do not have the resources and the time and the availability, that's a setback. So I'm just asking from this perspective, how can we make sure that, first of all, rules as they are designed and how they're implemented remain consistent with the objectives we have? And second of all, how we can make sure that there is dialogue in advance before setting certain rules, because they might backfire, sorry.
Okay, and perhaps just a very quick question, because this was also mentioned before by Chair, I think. I'll be devil's advocate, I know your position as interest representative, but would you consider that, let's say, enforcement options within a voluntary framework, as it is, are sufficient, or would a stronger deterrent be needed? And I'll ask this question also to Rafael later. We've heard before that, you know, in some countries there are.
So question is if mandatory versus voluntary framework. We believe the mandatory framework is absolutely welcome. And it's true what was said before, that in terms of sanctioning illegal activities, or as I said, like, I want to say something very clear. Illegal activities is not lobbying. It's illegal activities. They're two very different things. Corruption doesn't equal lobbying. And we fight for a recognition of lobbying as a professional activity that is revolving around policymaking. It's part of policymaking and lawmaking process. So we're all about having mandatory rules, sanctioning illegal activities, and having also potentially the legal framework for the institution to implement sanctions if there is need to be. On a voluntary basis, I do believe that there is still space to fill in the gaps with a strong mandatory framework and a voluntary framework that, as I mentioned before, when I had my statement, we also believe very much in code of conduct, in education, in making sure that the general public has a good, thorough understanding of what is lobbying, why it's necessary. And as you know, there is a reputational bias around lobbyists and lobbying as such. So that's also something that comes from voluntary access to code of conduct and other kind of rules. But we're absolutely not against mandatory framework.
Okay, and similar question to you, Raffaele. Raffaele, you mentioned before several scandals starting to more than 10 years ago with Goldman Sachs, then going on Qatargate, Huawei, I think you also mentioned. So would a stronger deterrent be needed? Also a very quick question to you before I'll give the floor again to Jörg for a last round of questions.
Just before, I think we have a question from the public, if you don't mind, just right there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, one point that I wanted also to raise was about the fact that exactly a transparency register is also very useful to identify if there is a balance of interest which is respected. And in that sense, I also wanted to say that, for instance, we made, and how the legal framework also can help is sufficient for that. And as an organization, we made also a review about, in particular, the permanent representations, which included different things, also the data that is available to the public about the work that they do in a context where you know that it's, for example, it's impossible to know how member states, what is the position of member states in the working parties, but also particularly their publication of meeting in the transparency register, with the interest representatives, and we found that there are a lot of gaps there. So my question was, how do you think the legal framework can, the current legal framework, or maybe a reform, can actually help to make this more transparent, and also to that there is an attention to the fact that a certain balance in the interest, in the public interest, should be respected.
Well, thank you for the question. I think this goes probably to Fernando in his direction, but feel free, all the speakers, to intervene on that.
I mean, totally in agreement with the balance of interest. It is something that is in our guidance for both for working parties or preparatory bodies, and also for officials. One thing, because I am directly concerned, balancing depends very, very much also on who is asking for a meeting. I mean, when you are on the side of as a civil servant, because it happens to me, I mean, certainly if nobody, I'm not going to try to meet people who has not asked for. I can assure you that nobody has. So the balance is probably biased, in my case, probably towards organizations like Rafael's ones, because they ask much more often, not for any other reason. But we have certainly this obligation to keep it, which I mentioned with probably publicity is the one of the things that makes it more easy. On permanent representation, one thing, I mean, they have an obligation which was unilateral. There is a legal problem behind, which is important. I mean, you have at national level very different legislations and very different practices. It is also that it is not obvious that an harmonization will be the best because this is national politics. It is very difficult that a minister to separate when he is acting as a national minister and when he is acting as a member of the council, and it will be impossible to apply different rules. So probably it makes sense to keep it at a national level. And anyhow, of course, permanent representatives and their deputies have to publish their meetings when they are in the presidency or in the 6 months before. By the way, at least one of them has already notified and unilaterally commit to do it on a permanent basis. So after the presidency, they decided to continue. So it is important. Just one thing on the position of the member states. I changed my hat because I'm also head of transparency, meaning access to documents in the council. We are releasing almost 90% of them. I mean, very, very little is redacted today on comments from member states. But again, this is not lobbying transparency. This is not the transparency register. Member states, this is just the decision, the transparency of the decision-making processes in the council, and I think huge progress have been made in recently. And how in the publication of meetings, I mean, we have different practices, and I think coming back to probably, if you give me 2 minutes, on a more philosophical question. I mean, because we are talking about the three institutions in the interinstitutional agreement opted for a system which is not harmonization and is not legislation, not doing legislation. As I mentioned it before, I think it works. I mean, and it is working, and we have mentioned it, that the sanction of being removed from the register de facto has a very, very strong deterrent effect on the interest representatives. For them, it is really something that they care and they react. You could have a system, but I mean, probably we are thinking that it is better necessarily an harmonization. I mean, I don't see so obvious. I mean, it is clear that now institutions, they have their own autonomy, and each of them is tailoring how to apply the rules, because this is different. Some of them have members, the Parliament, the Commission. The Council has members, but it is in a totally different sense because they are national ministers, so not only EU staff. And so every institution is trying to find it. It is something that more or less all other institutions we are seeing now, because at least 3 of them have already joined it. We think this is a very interesting development. Agencies should also be joining in the transparency register, and we encourage certainly them, and we are trying to reach out for them to also join. But it is obvious that everyone has their own specificities, and the rules will certainly not be one for all. So, which is probably good, and there is a sort of emulation, and we have seen with the Parliament recent decision after the Commission, and now the Council also considering that there is a certain emulation. As soon as one of the institutions goes in a certain direction, it creates a certain pressure to go along the same line, so a certain competition to follow the best practices of the others. So I think the current system proposes clearly an equilibrium, that it is not so obvious that it will be so easily achieved via harmonization. Many, many thanks.
I think I offered before to Rafael, Rafael, maybe just quick words. Would stronger deterrent be needed? Fernando does not seem to agree.
Just very quickly, just bouncing back on the balanced stakeholder representation, it's just that I want everyone also to fully understand what it actually means in the data, because this is some of the work that I do. And if we look at those 16,000 meetings that were held with the European Commission since the 1st of December, only 16% were with civil society organizations. So that's less than 1 in 5 meetings. This is also a marked degradation compared to before, because in the previous mandate we were at 30%. So I'll just leave it at that as food for thought, especially sort of in this discussion when we're talking about NGO advocacy, and really just to try to understand what is the actual reach. And when it comes to the Commission, it is quite little, unfortunately. Now, to answer your question that you asked to me, I would really say today that we cannot wait for the next gate to happen. We have Huawei Gate, Qatar Gate, Russia Gate, China Gate. I lost count of the amounts of gates that I've witnessed in my career at Transparency International, and we really shouldn't wait for the next one. So do we need more credible deterrence? I think for the lobbyists, it is actually quite clear that if we have the conditionality principle and the risk of deregistration, that acts as one step of the one part of the answer. I think the other part of the answer is also to ensure that the ethics rules for the decision makers are really in order. I outlined a number of reforms, specifically for the European Parliament, that are urgently needed, because right now it is a very permissive system that does not necessarily prevent conflicts of interest, nor does it really is equipped to safeguard against undue influence. And that means that those rules internally must be reformed now.
Okay, speaking of gates, we will have to exit our gates very soon. So I would like to go slowly toward the conclusions. But just before I conclude, I would have one final, really short question for the two gentlemen, for Raphael and for Mark. You all know the history, so could you give us like in 1 to 10 grade, where were we 10 years ago and where are we now?
No, I think in terms of a grade, I would say that we are at least on the transparency level, we're definitely approaching a 7 or 8. There are still a number of areas of improvement, as we said, especially on the areas of permanent representation. But when it comes to the ethics rules, I think we're more of a 4 or a 5 right now, and sometimes maybe a bit less. So that is also the difficulties with getting lobby regulations right, because you have to look at all the aspects of it. And you will see that in most member states, often they're very good on one part and not good on the others. There are very few countries that get all of them right, but we have the opportunity to actually do that now.
Well, 10 years ago is when I started my career in Brussels, exactly. So when I had the opportunity for the first time to have hands-on something I was studying until then when I was doing my thesis in law about intermediate bodies. I was very, very for some reason passionate about the topic, and I came in a certain framework where rules were not as strict. You mentioned before about Juncker Commission and the turn of events that started the whole process that we're still assisting today. I'm optimistic. I think that we are doing amazing progress. As CEP, we are having organizations from other countries, third countries, like Brazil recently, that are interested in looking at our models to regulate the professional activities and interest representation in a manner that is more regulated, even if this is just a framework, non-legislative framework. Maybe one day will be legislative, but the idea is that I think we're going through to the right direction, towards the right direction. I echo what maybe you implied before. We do not have to wait until the next scandal to act upon what we already see as a pathway. I do think that there is a lot of attention right now on how we can, of course, improve in our small bubble. Of course, so here a lot of people are from the European Court of Auditors. Some people are engaging in policy making and lawmaking activities like I do on behalf of the organizations I represent. But then there is a deeper question, which is how can we make sure that the European institutions and the European Union remains credible before the citizens that we represent. And that, I think, it's fundamental that we address this in a way that we keep building a trustworthy relationship with the citizens of the European Union. Sorry.
And this is exactly what we do today as well, with both of the panels. So I would conclude with a statement that I already mentioned. Don't get me wrong, I'm very much on the side of lobbying because it's an essential democratic tool. It allows organizations and individuals to provide input for the policy and decision making. I'm happy to hear very good grades, which means that Brussels is doing well. I would also give an 8, definitely, maybe even already almost 9. But as said, lobbying is not without the risks, so it's important that all actors work together, as we do today, to improve the existing practice and strive for the higher transparency to allow for the better public scrutiny. So much from my panel. Now back to you, but we are not done yet. Yeah.
No, we're not done yet. We still have the last act, and thank you so much to the panelists so far. But now Jan Gregor, who is also with us since the start, he's the Dean of Chamber 5, which is in charge of audits in administration and financing the European Union. So Jan will help us connect the dots from both sessions and perhaps also let us know what's in store for us.
Thank you very much, Damien. First of all, I would like to thank to participants of today's session. We've had about 150 colleagues, including those in the room and online. And of course, I would like to thank to all the distinguished guests we had as speakers today from European Parliament, from civil society, from DG Budge, from academic sphere, from the transparency domain. So I think this is how it should be not only sincere cooperation between the institution, but between various stakeholders. ECA will stand as a guardian of public finance principles, and as transparency is one of the key principles. It has definitely many layers and angles to which our speakers have contributed or enabled us to understand better. I think all the speakers could possibly agree that transparency is an important enabler of trust, or rather keeping the trust. We have heard it a number of times. Fostering trust through auditing. Without trust, there is no EU. Transparency is not the goal in itself, but it's an enabler of trust. Also, non-transparency erodes trust, and also one take that it's not the registers and conditionality, it's not a burden, but a safeguard that enhances trust. So there were many angles that just reconfirm the importance. We also discussed in more detail our two reports with quite important recommendations that we sincerely believe that contribute to improve the system. There are a few kind of food for thought for future. I think there was also a call that transparency should be seen broader than just publishing the beneficiaries. It should be also about the way how calls are done and selections of projects. There were also, I think we received quite important information from the Commission that in the new regulation there is intention for a very ambitious project on a single gateway, so we definitely keep the fingers crossed. We also heard that having one definition of at EU level is not enough, that there are perhaps various approaches in different jurisdictions, so this is also an element where there should be some harmonization. And I think there was also one element that perhaps between institutions we should focus on sincere cooperation. We don't need this to be covered by grant agreements which are still kept secret. We also had an interesting second session with important recommendations stemming from our report. We have also heard about the improvements of the register and general and targeted checks, with a bit of historical overview looking at how the EU has done over more than a decade. And I think I noted we need to highlight the issue of conflict of interest, by the way, which also we cover and recommend in our annual report in chapter administration. When we find something, we always try to highlight. A bit of good practice from OECD, I think, so we should always do better. So this is perhaps, there are some elements in moving the institutions to the Great 10. This also includes harmonization of conditionality, and also basically, and this is not only this area, but I generally understand that the European Commission should play a role model for member states in many areas, not only in this, but also in financial management and control. And with that, I think just return to the keyword of today. Maybe I should have counted how many times colleagues have used the word trust. It was definitely few tens of use, and I think this is important goal that transparency contributes to trust. Thank you very much to your attention today. Have a nice day.